Tracy Bell was last seen on March 6, 2018.
Tracy was a no-call, no-show. I said, send somebody to our house, like pronto. But when the police got there, no signs of Tracy.
Some people think like she just left, but I don't think so. If she was gonna leave, why she didn't take her car with her?
Her family is desperate for answers.
The officers, they wound up finding her keys in the parking lot. Why is her keys tossed away? Where is Tracy?
I ran into some paperwork in the closet in her bedroom from Tracy's ex-boyfriend.
I think he was living a double life because he's supposed to have a wife.
This episode of Disappeared retraces Tracy's last known steps.
There's a few different theories that lends itself to an accident or foul play. So we decided we have to conduct a search.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. We're here for Tracy. Zoom in.
It was kind of like hit you in the gut, and you're thinking, something ain't right, but I just don't know it yet. I'm just gonna keep digging until I find her.
The more people who know Tracy's story, the greater the chance of bringing her.
I'm Luella Bell, and I'm Tracy Bell's mother. She disappeared on March 6, 2018, from Richland Park. She was born and raised here in Chicago.
I'm Stephanie Thomas. I'm Tracy Bell's favorite cousin. Tracy and I grew up together since we were 10 or so, and we refer to each other as favorite cousins because we didn't have like a sister to grow up with, so that was our thing. Tracy grew up on the south side of Chicago, so she's pretty much a real city girl. She likes to hang out and have fun, very easygoing, hardworking. Tracy liked school. Her thing was to get a job so that she could become independent of her mom and dad and move out and get her own place.
My daughter Tracy went to college here in Chicago. She was 20-something when she had Giovanna.
We would call her Gigi. I don't remember exactly when Tracy started to date Giovanna's dad, but they went their separate ways. I think she let him come around to see Giovanna, but of course he just, backed off at some point. And then she dated another young man some years after that, and then he also vanished. But that's not something that she wanted people to know. Tracy started working for the state's attorney's office as a secretary, and she loved her job.
I'm Maurice Macklin. I'm a retired deputy chief from the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. Started there June 1st, 1990. Was an investigator, moved up through the ranks from investigator, sergeant, commander, and then deputy chief. And then as I moved up in rank, Tracy was right there as my assistant. She was very meticulous about her stuff, and she was very organized. So I can always depend on her. So she was a good employee. When I first came there, we was co-workers, then we became family members because me and her would argue like we brothers and sisters.
Early 90s, she purchased her condo, and she loved it because it was 2 baths, 2 beds, so that way she could have some space that was her space, and then still have, more than enough room for Giovanna and whomever wanted to visit.
She cared about Gigi. She used to try to make sure she had the means to do things as she was a young kid.
Giovanna met her future husband, and it seemed that Tracy liked him initially. They made a nice little young couple.
She must have been 17 or 18, and then she may have been 19, something like that. She wasn't that old when she got married to this boy.
And then once they were married, I think he joined the military, and they had their first child together, a daughter. He was in the military and then stationed outside of the state of Illinois. That's, I think, when we started to see a different side of him. And we were not particularly fond of him, of what was going on with him. And it may not have just been him. It may have been the two of them together. It just wasn't a good fit.
She got deeply into that drinking, Giovanna did. That made things even worse.
And when she drank, she turned into a different person. And Tracy many times would, let her know, Gigi, you can't, drinking is not for you. But she'd become just irrational and sometimes even violent. She could not control her drinking habits. By the time that Giovanna and her husband came back to the state of Illinois, I think they had 2 children. And they moved in with Tracy. And it wasn't ideal for Tracy because now you've got 4 people in and out in her place. And you go to work and you come home and things are a mess. Which was difficult for her because she was used to not sharing her space. And she had asked them to move, but they didn't ever move out. And along came child number 3. I think that's when this husband of hers became very, demanding, angry, unlikable for both Tracy and Giovanna, especially for Tracy, because now he's not just being mean to the wife, he's being mean sometimes to the kids and also to Tracy.
She had a lot she was dealing with, and I don't know how she managed to deal like that as long as she did, because that would weigh me down tremendously.
You could tell it was wearing on him when it came to work. She was like missing things, and it was, as I think about it, that should have been a telltale sign too about that she just needed to go somewhere, just rest for 24 hours and just some me time. She was tired of being up all night sometimes or dealing with what's going on with her daughter and her son-in-law. And she said, I'm finna change the lock so nobody can get in there. I said, no, you can't do that. You got to go through steps. You need to talk to somebody about this. And then she found out about the eviction process.
My daughter was finally able to get an eviction order to get her daughter to vacate from her property. They gave her a date that was on March the 6th. So that day, my granddaughter, the kids got her stuff and she went over to the hotel. That's where she got a place to be because she could no longer be there.
Tracy had took some time off leading up to March 5th, so she took off that Friday and that Monday. On March 6, 2018, Tracy was a no-call, no-show. Tracy always communicated about being off, and when it became a no-call, no-show for Tracy Bell, that was definitely something of urgent that we needed to take care of. I wasn't at work because I had the flu, but I said, send somebody to our house like pronto, like now. Because of the history, I knew what was going on with the eviction, things of that nature. So that's why we had sent investigators out to their house right away. But when they got on the scene, they said, hey, we don't see her, she's not in the condo. So they continued to do their search around and look for Tracy. And then they find Tracy hiding under the stairs. The way they explained it to me is just that like she was just hiding and then she came out like, okay, you found me. And that was it. And then she became really standoffish, like, hey, I'm okay, leave me alone, basically. And they were like, hey, we're here to help you. They was trying to get her to just talk and try to figure out why you are up under these stairs. And that's something that she did not provide. She was just there.
That was weird. Why would you be tucked away? Why aren't you upstairs in your place? I mean, what was going on? Who's she hiding from and why?
That's why the paramedics show up. But she is like refusing medical treatment.
She probably would have been okay if she had went and got some medical treatment, because then that could have helped, but she refused to do that.
I sent her a text telling her basically, hey, I'm upset that you ain't let the medical staff examine you, but I'm glad they found you. And I said, I will talk to you later on. I will call you. And I was just relieved that she was okay. That was the main thing. Wednesday, March 7th, Same situation comes up where Tracy's a no call, no show. And I'm like, wait a minute, get back over to the house right away again. So dispatch Richmond Park Police right back to the house again. I eventually wind up going over there. Luella, my mom, was there at the house, at the condo when I pulled up. And we had to wind up ordering a locksmith to gain entry into the condo. Inside there was a lot of alcohol bottles in the front where Gigi and her husband were staying at. Had kids' clothes and things of that nature around the house, around the condo. And that was basically it when we got there. And no signs of Tracy. Then also went to the back area to check the stairs to make sure she wasn't hiding in the stairs, so she was not there either.
It was a mess, because the kids' stuff was everywhere, and it wasn't nothing in order. Now, her bedroom was pretty decent, but the living room and the kitchen area, it just, nobody had nothing put away.
The police instinct came out first of looking at what's what. Is there a sign of struggle in here? Is there anything else, blood evidence, anything that you could see to say, hey, this is a crime scene, and go from there? But we didn't see that. But Tracy's purse was there. No cell phone and no keys to the vehicles was inside the purse. At that point in time, I'm trying to figure out, I'm like, okay, so did she just grab her keys and cell phone and just left out the house in a hurry to just make a quick run somewhere? But the thing was, her car was still there. So if your car is still there, where are you going? That didn't add up. Did not make sense. And, for your purse to be there, I'm like, no, you normally take your purse with you. So just to grab 2 items and go out, that doesn't make sense at all. So it's kind of like hit you in the gut, and you're thinking, something ain't right, but I just don't know it yet. I'm just gonna keep digging until I find it. We wind up calling the K9, and they found a scent of Tracy coming out of the apartment, and the dogs just stopped right in the parking lot, just stopped. There was no more it appeared like somebody picked her up and drove away.
It's not that far. If this is the door, here's the parking lot. It's not like it's a long walk. Yeah, you step outside the door and it's only a few feet before, you're right in the path of where the cars are parked.
Now, the officers, they wound up finding her keys in the parking lot away from her car by another car. So it was just by chance with them just looking in the parking lot and they found her keys. So now, why is her keys tossed away? I knew something was wrong. You're trying to figure out, did somebody grab her? Where is Tracy? We trying to figure out, did somebody grab her? They kind of threw us for a loop and didn't make sense on it. We had to do a step-by-step investigation. We didn't know if Tracy walked away, disappeared, some criminal activity. We didn't have nothing. He was eating me up on the inside. That's without a doubt. It was eating me up. But in order to bring Tracy home safely, I got to stay focused on the investigation, making sure we're using the right tools and resources to bring her back home. Richmond Park Police Department, and they only had like a couple of detectives. And we had my investigations bureau that had expertise in, wires, cell phone tracking, different things, investigators, homicide detectives. So that's when we came into the Richmond Park Police Department. I want to say it was about 8 or 9 of us walking in. They like, Tracy's one of us. She's a family member. We're here to assist you in this investigation of our own person too. So Dad reached out to Sergeant Margaret.
My name is Margaret. I'm a sergeant with Cook County State's Attorney's Office, Investigations Bureau. Tracy Bell was the administrative assistant to that unit, the unit I supervised. But we did not have any personal interaction at that time. And through the interviews of her colleagues who shared her workspace, we learned that Tracy was having difficulty in her home, which stemmed primarily from the difficult relationship between her daughter and her daughter's husband.
She started sharing stories about what was going on with Giovanna and her husband. She was saying there's a lot of domestic problems, and you could see it in Tracy's face. I started putting stuff together.
Some of the calls for service Richmond Park Police documented to Tracy Bell's condominium historically included domestic violence incidents between her daughter and her daughter's husband.
I had conversations with Tracy and other family members about Giovanna and her husband being violent, about Giovanna having, broken ribs, broken eye socket or something, him dragging her down the sidewalk in front of the kids, and really just ugliness.
Tracy wanted to do something about it herself, and we had domestic violence experts down there to where she could talk to, say, hey, what steps or resources can my daughter use to get out of this situation or to help the situation or something?
I learned the weekend prior to Tracy's disappearance, she had telephone contact with Richmond Park Police Department and the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services relative to her grandchildren.
Tracy made the call to Child Protective Services on Giovanna's husband. I believe it was something that he had supposedly done to the son, the youngest child. And I believe DCFS had pulled all 3 children from the home.
But shortly after the children were placed with DCFS, a medical review unfounded the allegations of abuse, and those children were returned to their parents.
They gave the children back to Giovanna. Now, Tracy still doesn't have peace of mind because now these kids are back in the hands of their mom and possibly their dad. So you're still worried about them.
During the early stages of the investigation, it became important to have formal interviews of Giovanna as well as her husband. We formally interviewed the husband at a suburban police agency. He accounted for his whereabouts, and he was cooperative. We were also able, the following day, to formally interview Giovanna. Her recollection was inconsistent, but attribution to whether or not that was her memory or her substance abuse was difficult to determine at the time. So that interview, it did not provide any additional leads.
Giovanna eventually just kind of got on a negative, she just stopped dealing with any of us because she felt like we were pointing a finger at her husband. And we weren't, we just wanted to talk to her.
My personal opinion, anything that deals with my mom and my mom is missing, I'm gonna be calling you every day. I'm gonna be sending you a text like, hey, what's the update? What's going on?
Although there was an established history of domestic violence between Giovanna and her husband, there was never an allegation that I'm aware of violence between Tracy Bell and Giovanna's husband or Tracy Bell and Giovanna. So we had to continue our investigation.
So I believe that Thursday I met Tracy's supervisor, Maurice, at her condo. And then I, just kind of picking things up off the floor and straightening things up, I ran into some paperwork from Tracy's ex-boyfriend. It's like, wow, this stuff is only like 6 months old. So that means that this person's now back in her life. When you're telling us for the last several years, he was not in your life. I was so taken aback until I kind of threw my hands up. I was like, what's going on? While cleaning Tracy's apartment, and I ran across mail of her ex-boyfriends, I was just thrown aback because he's not in the picture anymore, is what I've been told for the last several years. But this mail was like 6 months old. I was confused because in the past when I knew him, when they were dating, when Giovanna was little, we all got along with him. He was fun. It was great, fun guy to be around. But when they stopped seeing each other, I didn't know. I was like, okay, things fall together, they fall apart. But, after asking her for several years, are you still, seeing this guy? Are you guys friends? No. Like me, adamantly, like, no, he's a clown. Okay. So when I saw the mail, I was just like, okay.
But he wasn't my cup of tea because he dealt with other people's too, and there was some competition there with Tracy. And I don't know why she kept seeing him.
To my knowledge, Tracy wasn't in no relationship with anybody at that point, but we still had to follow up on find out about her ex-boyfriend. Like, hey, when did y'all break up, or when was the last time y'all seen each other? Did you pick her up on the 7th? So those are things that was those pointed questions that needed to be asked about that person. So if he is going to be a suspect, let's clear this up right away.
We were able to ascertain his identity and make contact with him, and he did provide time for us to do an interview at his home. He appeared cooperative. He answered their questions, denied a current relationship with Tracy, and suggested his contact with her was limited to the fall of 2017. In a review of the historical records from Tracy's phone, his known numbers were consistent with not having contacted her cell phone since September of 2017.
He was very forthcoming right away, and definitely wanted to make sure because he had a life of his own and married and stuff, so he was able to clear this up. I don't think he wanted that to bleed off into his personal life right then and there.
But see, I think he was living a double life because he's supposed to have a wife. That's what I heard.
I felt like they always had a decent relationship, so even if they were on friendly terms again, maybe she just does not want 20 questions from us, like, so you're friends with him? You guys dated, you broke up, and now you're friends again, he's hanging out, what's going on? Maybe she didn't want all those questions.
So at this point, what do we have? We need to look through everything again and again.
We have to follow the evidence, and the evidence suggests it's just as possible Tracy Bell left on her own accord.
So Richmond Park Police put on their website that Tracy Bell was missing. So those little identifiers and the stuff in the neighborhood that was done.
They were able to create a missing persons flyer, distribute it to the Cook County Sheriff's Court Services Department, which covered all of our locations.
There was a vigil that was organized, was put together with the state's attorney's office and some family members. And so, several coworkers came out, detectives, clerical, a dozen or so family members, and probably people exchanged information so that we could stay in touch with one another. Giovanna didn't show up for that. When we did foot searches, we let her know we were gonna go out. She never did any of those. In fact, Giovanna she got on bad terms with all of us for one reason or another. I believe so that she would not have to deal with us.
So then, where else do you go? Because you could say that sometimes people are confused and they do wind up in places because they don't know what is what. But then if you're showing pictures and asking questions and nobody's seen anybody like that, it's like they don't exist.
In December of 2018, the investigation felt like it stood still. But just when we think there's nothing, a coworker who's known her for over 25 years is sure she saw Tracy Bell at a western suburb at a restaurant. It's not that far from Tracy Bell's relatives who live in the south suburbs. It's a viable lead.
Tracy Bell was last seen on March 6, 2018. If you have any information, please contact the Cook County Sheriff Police's Missing Person Project at 773-674-9490.
At the low point in the investigation, we were uplifted when a colleague from Cook County State's Attorney's Office, who had known Tracy for over 25 years, reported that she swear she saw Tracy ahead of her in line at a restaurant. It was December, so it was cold. Everybody was bundled up, and she said it was exactly Tracy with a different hair and purple lipstick. With that information, we were able to go to the restaurant. We requested video, but some time had passed, and unfortunately, that video had been overwritten.
It brings excitement because you're like, okay, somebody saw her, so she's alive walking around. But then you sitting back like, is this a mistaken identity? I try not to get my hopes that high right then and there. I'm like, okay, until I actually hear that Tracy Bell voice, we're gonna follow these tips and see where it leads us.
Richton Park filed a request by her service provider, and they were provided limited access to cell phone data. Unfortunately, her device was last used the evening before she was reported missing. It did not provide any additional leads. We were also able to request to be notified should any financial activity occur. No activity had been present on her accounts since the weekend prior to her disappearance.
Some of the people want to think like she just left, but I don't think so, because she had a plan of redoing her house. And she had also just got a new car. So if she was going to leave, why she didn't take her car with her?
Regarding the supposed sightings, I don't buy into it because of her medical conditions. She had rheumatoid arthritis, diabetes, got to take your medications daily. There's not been any activity on her bank account. Her vehicle's not being moved. You know, how's she getting around? How's she surviving with no money? The Tracy that I know would not have just vanished into thin air, you know, like saying to the world, you know, kiss my ass world. I'm not feeling like, you know, she's alive. And I wanted to know, you know, what happened to her.
In the fall of 2021, we learned that the Cook County Sheriff's Department was creating a missing persons project, which coincided with our investigation and our need for further assistance.
The Sheriff's Office will now have a dedicated link on its website and have also dedicated 3 detectives to start working these missing persons cases full-time.
My name's Tom Dart. I am Sheriff of Cook County. I've been Sheriff now for 17 years. Back in September of 21, I want to formalize a specific missing persons unit because in the spectrum of things law enforcement works on, missing persons is pretty low on the spectrum. The reason being is because this person went missing today and an hour later they're back. Those things happen all the time, which lends itself to then not being treated as seriously by departments at times. And so as a result of that, it really requires you to have some really focused people working on it. And so one of the ones we're actively on now is Tracy Bell's case.
My name is Jason Moran. I'm a detective commander with the Cook County Sheriff's Police. What our first job to do is to start looking at all the available information. So we'll reach out to the originating agencies and we'll ask them to see the reports and any evidence that was collected.
There was a meeting in March of 2021 with the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, Investigations Bureau, and Richmond Park Police Department, as well as Cook County Sheriff's Police. During that meeting, there was a disclosure by Richmond Park Police Department about a report on the evening Tracy Bell went missing that was not something known to the State's Attorney's Office prior to March of 21. This report was not identified, in part because the description was a female Hispanic. Tracy Bell was a very light-skinned black female, but it established itself as the last known sighting of Tracy Bell.
This officer was concerned for this woman's well-being, that she appeared to be confused in some way. And this is at the McDonald's restaurant near Lake George, maybe 50 feet away from Lake George. While Tracy appeared to be confused, she was not interested in having the police or paramedics assist her. So once we realized Tracy was in that area at night by Lake George, is it possible that Tracy was having a mental health issue or a medical issue, maybe like a low blood sugar? And could she have had an accident?
Given the fact that the hours following her disappearance were particularly frigid for that time of year.
It's large enough where you could conceivably see an individual going there and passing away.
It's sort of a place that sort of screamed for additional searches. So we decided we have to conduct a search.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. We're here for Tracy. You know that she was last seen down at this McDonald's here. And about 50 feet behind that McDonald's is Lake George here. So what we're trying to do is learn if Tracy, for whatever reason, came into the lake and unfortunately drowned. And we could find her remains, or we could find her clothing or something that puts her here. We're gonna walk along the shoreline to see if there's anything that's important. We're also gonna do UAV in the air and a remote control submarine. If anything is found, holler out and we'll assess what evidence you're seeing. Okay, perfect. Go ahead. The drones, they're really great to sort of see a larger area. It helps us understand the scene. It also helps us locate evidence that we otherwise wouldn't see. We're gonna go look at the screen now. What's that long thing in the back? The long white thing next to that lure or that bobber. That just wood.
Yeah, I could see a million different scenarios where someone came in, fell in, whatever it might be, and no one would see that.
And in case Tracy did go in,
Yeah.
so that's where this submarine would come in.
So our latest addition to this ASRT team has been the new ROV. It's a submersible, remote-operated vehicle. They use these on shipwrecks. They use these same type of devices. They go 200-300 meters deep.
Bodies are usually within a just very short distance of where they go in.
The McDonald's is just right on the other side of that, so we're working towards that direction.
There's rocks there, so we can't go any further.
Well, all we can do is try. And we're gonna let the family know too that we were out here trying.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're not gonna give up.
Yeah, no.
We've done a lot of work at this point. We have not ruled out any options.
Around the time of Tracy's disappearance, she could have been going through mental and/or medical issue. There's a few different theories that lends itself to an accident or foul play.
We know that the relationship between Giovanna and her husband was increasing in frequency of domestic violence at the time of her disappearance.
Missing person cases are a mystery, some more mysterious than others. And in Tracy's case, we could not discount the fact that she could have been gone due to suspicious circumstances and or foul play. That is something that we still are weighing and we are still looking at.
Giovanna passed last October 2022. It was difficult. It was difficult because, Tracy's been missing since 2018, and now her only child is gone. And we still don't have, answers to Tracy's disappearance.
When I found out about Giovanna passing, it took me back. I was like, wait a minute, she passed because she's young. So you're looking at that, you're like, wait a minute, what happened?
She passed away from a drug overdose, fentanyl. I know she always drank, but as far as her to dabble in anything other than that, no knowledge. But things change, people change.
And I think it was that she didn't want to live anymore. I really do. I think that, that's just my personal thought. Because her mother wasn't here anymore. During
Giovanna's funeral, her husband was incarcerated because of a domestic disturbance with Giovanna. Part of me believes that Giovanna knew something.
I think, to me, in my opinion, I think Gigi might have known something. She might have known something extra, but she just didn't reveal it. And we lost an opportunity when she passed away.
Tracy Bell has been missing for over 5 years, and we're still investigating her disappearance. For all missing persons, your case does not close until the missing returns or is located.
We are still just kind of hanging in limbo. Her disappearance has affected so many people, and left a lot of us with a lot of unanswered questions and confused. And, I miss our long conversations. I miss her laugh. That's a thing that is not easy to deal with, losing a child
And the main part about
November 7th, 1974. London was settling into another cold autumn evening, the kind of night that encouraged people to pull curtains tight against the darkness and retreat into the quiet rituals of home. The streets of Belgravia glowed beneath rows of amber street lamps, their reflections stretching across rain-darkened pavement. Elegant Georgian townhouses stood shoulder to shoulder, dignified and silent, guarding secrets accumulated over generations of privilege. Behind polished black doors and neatly trimmed railings lived diplomats, businessmen, old aristocratic families, and people whose names regularly appeared in newspapers, though seldom for reasons that invited sympathy. Among those stately homes stood a residence on Lower Belgrave Street. From the outside, nothing distinguished it from the neighboring houses except the reputation attached to its occupants. It belonged to a family whose title reached back centuries into British history, a family carrying the weight of ancient nobility, inherited wealth, and social prestige. Yet behind those brick walls, beneath the carefully maintained appearance of aristocratic respectability, years of bitterness had slowly transformed a family home into a battlefield where every conversation felt like another round in a war that refused to end. By the following morning, one woman would be dead. Another would survive with blood running through her hair, barely able to stand. And the man whom almost everyone believed responsible would disappear so completely that more than half a century later, investigators, journalists, historians, amateur detectives, and ordinary people would still be asking the same impossible question. Where did Lord Lucan go? Some mysteries begin with uncertainty. A missing hiker. An unidentified body. A suspicious fire with too many possible explanations. The mystery of Lord Lucan begins differently. It begins with a crime scene that appears almost straightforward. A nanny murdered. A wife brutally attacked. Physical evidence pointing toward a single suspect. Witnesses describing years of conflict. Letters. Blood. A discarded car. Every piece seems to fit together with unsettling precision. And then, at the exact moment when the investigation should have become simple, the central figure vanishes. Not for days. Not for weeks. Forever. No confirmed sighting. No recovered body. No confession. No arrest. No trial. Only rumors that spread across continents, each one sounding just believable enough to keep the legend alive for another year. Some insisted they had seen him sipping wine in South Africa beneath another name. Others claimed he was managing a remote sheep farm in New Zealand. There were whispered stories placing him in Australia, India, Brazil, even hidden among wealthy expatriates protected by old aristocratic friendships. Every few years another photograph surfaced. Another anonymous letter arrived. Another elderly man was identified as the missing Earl. Every lead promised answers. Every lead dissolved into nothing. The case became larger than a murder investigation. It became one of Britain's greatest modern myths. Yet myths have a dangerous habit of overshadowing reality. When people hear the name Lord Lucan today, they often remember the disappearance before they remember the victim. They remember newspaper headlines, conspiracy theories, and decades of speculation. They picture a handsome aristocrat who somehow escaped one of the largest manhunts in modern British history. They imagine secret passports, hidden fortunes, loyal friends willing to protect him at any cost. But long before the mystery began, before newspapers transformed the fugitive into a cultural obsession, there was a woman named Sandra Rivet. She was not a member of the aristocracy. She had no inherited fortune. She possessed no famous family name capable of filling newspaper columns for decades. She went to work that evening expecting an ordinary shift caring for children. She never returned home. That simple truth often disappears beneath the weight of the legend. Every famous criminal case has a gravitational pull. The more extraordinary the suspect becomes, the easier it is for the victim to fade into the background. In this story, the disappearance of one man has fascinated generations, but the life violently taken inside a quiet London townhouse deserves equal remembrance. Behind every mystery lies a human cost measured not in headlines, but in empty chairs, unanswered phone calls, and families forced to continue living while the world becomes captivated by someone else's vanishing act. Perhaps that is what makes this case so unsettling. It contains two stories unfolding simultaneously. One is the story everyone knows. A titled nobleman disappears into history. The other is the story people too often forget. A hardworking woman loses her life because she happened to walk into the wrong room at the wrong moment. Those two stories collide on a single autumn evening. To understand why, we must step back into Britain during the early 1970s. It was an era caught between old traditions and a rapidly changing society. The British aristocracy still carried prestige, but its foundations had begun to crack. Vast estates were increasingly expensive to maintain. Many noble families found themselves asset-rich but desperately short of cash. Public respect for inherited privilege was fading, replaced by growing skepticism toward institutions that had once seemed untouchable. Some aristocrats adapted. Others continued living as though the old world still existed. Richard John Bingham, the 7th Earl of Lucan, appeared determined to belong to that second group. He possessed everything that should have guaranteed success. He was educated at elite schools. Handsome, charming, athletic, intelligent enough to impress almost anyone during a first meeting. Friends described him as witty and remarkably composed under pressure. In London's exclusive gambling clubs, he became a familiar face, effortlessly blending confidence with cultivated sophistication. He understood the rules of high society because he had been born into them. Yet appearances can become elaborate disguises. Behind polished suits and measured smiles lay mounting debts, compulsive gambling, and an increasingly fragile personal life. Winning at the card table offered temporary relief. Losing deepened problems that were already spiraling beyond control. Financial pressure mixed with emotional resentment until each reinforced the other, creating a cycle from which escape became increasingly difficult. At the center of that storm stood his marriage. His wife, Veronica, better known as Lady Lucan, had once shared the glamorous life expected of Britain's upper class. Elegant parties, country estates, exclusive clubs, public photographs portraying confidence and privilege. To outsiders, they appeared to represent everything associated with aristocratic success. The reality inside the marriage proved painfully different. Arguments became routine. Trust disappeared. The relationship deteriorated into accusations, emotional distance, and eventually separation. Divorce itself was devastating enough for a family constantly observed by London's social circles. But what followed proved even more destructive. The custody battle over their 3 children. It was no longer merely a legal dispute. It became a struggle over identity, reputation, and control. Each court hearing intensified old grievances. Each unfavorable decision deepened resentment. Friends began noticing changes in Lord Lucan's behavior. Conversations returned repeatedly to the same subject. His frustration seemed impossible to conceal. Those closest to the family watched 2 people drift so far apart that compromise became almost unimaginable. Meanwhile, inside the Belgravia townhouse, daily life continued as normally as circumstances allowed. Children still needed dinner. Homework still had to be completed. Beds still required making. Someone still had to care for the household while legal battles unfolded beyond its walls. That responsibility often fell upon Sandra Rivet. She had accepted employment not because she wished to become part of an infamous chapter in British criminal history, but because she needed work. She represented thousands of ordinary people whose quiet dedication keeps households functioning without attracting attention. Reliable. Practical. Caring. The sort of person whose presence is most appreciated when everything runs smoothly and rarely acknowledged by anyone outside the family. On the evening of November 7th, she prepared for another routine night. Nothing suggested history was waiting inside the basement. Nothing warned that within the next hour, one decision as ordinary as walking downstairs would change the lives of everyone connected to that house forever. Outside, London continued moving exactly as cities always do. Buses carried passengers home. Couples finished late dinners. Taxi drivers searched for fares beneath the glow of streetlights. Somewhere, televisions broadcast evening programs while children prepared for bed. Thousands of lives unfolded without interruption. Inside one elegant townhouse, however, the ordinary rhythm of the night was quietly approaching its final moments. In less than an hour, violence would erupt with astonishing speed. Within days, Britain would become consumed by a mystery unlike anything it had witnessed in modern criminal history. And for more than 50 years afterward, one haunting question would remain unanswered, echoing through police files, newspaper archives, and the collective memory of an entire nation. Did Lord Lucan die that night? Or did he simply disappear into the shadows, leaving the truth to vanish with him? The first police officers who would later stand inside the house on Lower Belgrave Street could not have known they were stepping into a crime scene destined to become part of British history. To them, it began as another emergency call in a city that never truly slept. London had seen robberies, domestic disputes, unexplained deaths, and violent assaults before. Yet there was something different about this address even before anyone crossed its threshold. It belonged to a member of the British aristocracy. The name alone carried weight. Newspapers recognized it. Society recognized it. The police recognized it. But blood has a way of stripping away titles. It dries the same color whether it belongs to a labourer or a lord. That night, inside the narrow townhouse, every symbol of refinement was interrupted by something brutally primitive. The staircase still wore its polished finish. Family photographs still rested on tables. Children's belongings remained scattered where they had been left only hours earlier. Lamps continued casting warm pools of light across expensive carpets. At first glance, the house still resembled the home of a distinguished family. Then came the stains. Dark patches spreading across the floor. Smears reaching toward the hallway. Drops leading from one room to another like silent punctuation marks in a story too violent for words. Every mark represented panic. Every mark represented movement. Someone had fought desperately to survive. Violent crimes often unfold in astonishingly short periods of time. Investigators would later estimate that the crucial events inside the house consumed only minutes. A handful of ordinary minutes capable of dividing lives forever into a before and an after. That truth is difficult to grasp. We imagine tragedy announcing itself with warning signs, dramatic confrontations, or unmistakable danger. Reality is rarely so considerate. More often, catastrophe enters quietly, disguised as routine. A door opens. Footsteps descend a staircase. A light switch clicks. A voice calls from another room. Then everything changes. For Sandra Rivet, the evening had followed a familiar rhythm. The children needed attention. Household responsibilities demanded quiet efficiency. Nothing about those ordinary tasks hinted that death was waiting in the darkness below. The basement of the Belgravia house was not an unusual place. It served practical purposes common to London townhouses of its era. Storage. Utility rooms. Domestic necessities hidden beneath the elegant living spaces above. It was a place a nanny might visit without hesitation, perhaps to retrieve something, perhaps to complete another simple chore before the children settled for the night. There was no reason to be afraid. No reason to expect another person hiding in the shadows. No reason to imagine that the final moments of her life would occur in a room she had probably entered countless times before. The attack, according to investigators, was sudden and overwhelmingly violent. There is no evidence suggesting a prolonged confrontation. No indication that Sandra had the opportunity to escape. The injuries pointed instead toward an ambush, a burst of extraordinary force delivered before she fully understood what was happening. It is one of the most haunting aspects of this case. She was almost certainly not the intended target. That possibility transforms the crime from calculated murder into something even more unsettling. It suggests mistaken identity. It suggests someone waiting in darkness for another person to appear. It suggests that fate, rather than choice, determined who opened the basement door first. If true, Sandra Rivet died because she arrived moments before someone else. History occasionally pivots on differences measured in seconds. Had another person descended first? Had someone delayed by a brief conversation? Had a child needed attention upstairs for only another minute? The entire story might have unfolded differently. Those questions have no answers. Only possibilities. Above the basement, life continued, unaware that unimaginable violence had already erupted below. Then came Veronica. Lady Lucan. Separated from her husband, exhausted by years of legal conflict, trying to maintain some semblance of normal family life despite the emotional strain surrounding her. Like Sandra, she had no apparent reason to fear what awaited downstairs. She descended. What happened next survives primarily through her account, supported by the physical evidence investigators later documented throughout the house. She encountered an attacker. A struggle followed almost immediately. The assault was ferocious. Blows landed against her head with enough force to inflict severe injuries that, under slightly different circumstances, could easily have been fatal. Blood streamed down her face. Her vision blurred. Confusion gave way to raw survival instinct. Victims of sudden violence often describe time behaving strangely. Seconds expand into something resembling minutes. Small details become unforgettable while larger events disappear completely. The texture of a wall. The smell of damp air. The sound of breathing. The pressure of fingers against skin. Lady Lucan later recalled fighting back with remarkable determination. Not because she possessed extraordinary strength. Because survival leaves little room for surrender. She clawed. She struggled. At one point, she bit her attacker's hand. It was not an act of calculated defense taught through training. It was the instinctive reaction of someone refusing to become another victim. That single desperate action would later become one of the many details investigators examined while attempting to reconstruct the encounter. If the attacker bore bite marks, they reasoned, those injuries might become significant evidence. The struggle eventually created something the attacker may never have anticipated. An opportunity. Lady Lucan broke free. Bleeding heavily, injured and disoriented, she fled through the house and into the London night. The contrast could scarcely have been more striking. Inside the townhouse, terror. Outside, ordinary life continued uninterrupted. Passing motorists had no idea that only meters away, a woman was running for her life. She reached the home of nearby neighbors. She pounded on the door. When they opened it, they found not an elegant aristocrat concerned with appearances, but a gravely wounded woman covered in blood, barely able to speak, pleading for help. In that instant, the private nightmare inside the Lucan household ceased to be private. Other people now witnessed its aftermath. Emergency services were contacted. Questions began immediately. Who had attacked her? Was the assailant still inside? Were the children safe? Was anyone else injured? Every answer uncovered another layer of horror. When responders entered the Lucan residence, they eventually discovered Sandra Rivet. She could not be saved. Her death transformed the attack from attempted murder into homicide. The investigation that followed would become one of the largest and most intensely scrutinized criminal inquiries in modern British history. Yet before forensic laboratories, newspaper headlines, and international manhunts, there existed only confusion. Investigators faced a house filled with physical evidence but remarkably few witnesses. The children had survived physically unharmed. The attacker had disappeared. Time was already becoming the enemy. Every passing minute widened the distance between the suspect and those searching for him. Meanwhile, another story had already begun unfolding elsewhere in southern England. A man was driving away from London. Whether he believed he was escaping justice, escaping panic, or escaping an unbearable misunderstanding remains one of the central questions of the entire case. His destination would become important. His actions over the following hours would be examined countless times by detectives. His disappearance would ultimately eclipse almost everything else. But on that November night, no one yet understood that they were witnessing the beginning of one of Britain's longest-running mysteries. They still believed there would be an arrest. An interview. A trial. A verdict. The normal sequence of criminal justice. Instead, the investigation would soon collide with something far more elusive than guilt or innocence. Absence. A suspect who simply ceased to exist in any verifiable sense. No confirmed border crossing. No confirmed death. No confirmed new identity. Only a trail that seemed to dissolve into darkness almost as abruptly as the violence had emerged from it. Cases built around missing suspects often lose momentum with time. Witnesses forget. Physical evidence deteriorates. Public attention fades. This case did the opposite. Every year without answers made it more compelling. Every rumor gave it fresh life. Every anniversary revived old questions that had never been resolved. The murder itself remained horrifying. The disappearance transformed it into legend. And somewhere between those two realities, the undeniable facts inside the townhouse and the endless speculation beyond it, the truth became increasingly difficult to separate from myth. That is where the Lord Lucan case has remained ever since. Balanced uneasily between evidence and imagination, certainty and rumor, history and folklore. A murder can end in a courtroom. A mystery has no such ending. It simply waits, decade after decade, for someone to uncover the final piece that may no longer exist. There is an uncomfortable truth that emerges whenever people revisit the Lord Lucan case. The deeper the mystery became, the easier it was for the public to treat it like an elaborate detective novel rather than the aftermath of real human suffering. Headlines celebrated every supposed sighting. Television specials revisited theories with dramatic music and shadowed silhouettes. Newspapers eagerly printed anonymous tips from strangers convinced they had shared a drink with the missing Earl somewhere on the other side of the world. Every new rumor breathed fresh life into the legend. Yet none of those stories could answer the only questions that truly mattered. Why did one woman lose her life? Why was another left fighting to survive? And what happened during those crucial minutes inside the basement that changed British criminal history forever? Unlike many famous unsolved cases, the mystery here is not centered on identifying a suspect. Investigators never spent decades wondering who might have committed the attack. From the earliest hours of the investigation, attention focused overwhelmingly on one man. His relationship with the household, the bitter custody battle, the physical evidence recovered afterward, and the sequence of events that followed all pointed in the same direction. The unanswered question was never simply who. It was where. Where did he go after leaving London? Where did the trail disappear? Where did certainty end and speculation begin? Those questions would consume generations. But before we follow that trail into disappearing letters, abandoned vehicles, and impossible rumors, we have to understand the world that existed before blood was spilled. Crimes of this magnitude rarely erupt in isolation. They grow quietly beneath the surface, hidden behind ordinary conversations, polite smiles, and carefully maintained appearances. By the time violence finally arrives, it is often only the last visible chapter of a much longer story. That story did not begin on a November evening. It began years earlier, in drawing rooms where conversations remained courteous even when resentment was growing underneath them. It unfolded inside courtrooms where legal arguments about custody carried emotional wounds far deeper than the official documents suggested. It developed across gambling tables where fortunes changed hands in silence while personal debts quietly accumulated beyond control. To outsiders, the Lucans still belonged to a world many people admired. It was a world of inherited titles, exclusive clubs, elegant dinners, and country estates. Newspapers photographed races at Ascot, charity galas, and social gatherings where members of Britain's aristocracy smiled beneath expensive hats and tailored suits. Their lives appeared distant from ordinary struggles. Wealth seemed permanent. Prestige appeared untouchable. But appearances have always been one of the greatest accomplices to tragedy. Behind polished doors, marriages fail. Behind expensive curtains, families fracture. Behind respected names, fear can take root as easily as anywhere else. The Lord Lucan case shattered a comforting illusion that status somehow protected people from desperation. If anything, it demonstrated how privilege can sometimes conceal problems until they become impossible to ignore. By the mid-1970s, Britain itself was changing. Economic uncertainty had unsettled the country. Inflation was rising. Labor strikes regularly disrupted daily life. Old institutions that once seemed immovable were beginning to lose the unquestioned authority they had enjoyed for generations. Even the aristocracy, long viewed as symbols of permanence, found themselves confronting a modern world that demanded adaptation. Some adapted gracefully. Others struggled. Richard John Bingham appeared increasingly caught between those worlds. He carried an ancient title but faced very modern pressures. Gambling debts did not care about noble ancestry. Legal disputes over children ignored centuries of family prestige. Financial obligations arrived regardless of social rank. Those pressures formed the unseen backdrop to everything that followed. Still, no amount of financial hardship or emotional conflict can explain away violence. Thousands of people endure divorce, debt, and heartbreak without raising a hand against another human being. That distinction matters. Understanding circumstances is not the same as excusing actions. Throughout this story, it is important to separate explanation from justification. One seeks understanding. The other erases responsibility. This case deserves the first, never the second. As investigators would later discover, relationships surrounding the Lucan family had become increasingly strained. Friends found themselves navigating awkward loyalties. Some remained sympathetic to Lord Lucan. Others worried about Veronica's safety. Conversations that had once revolved around parties and sporting events gradually shifted toward legal proceedings and growing personal conflict. No one could know where those tensions were heading. Hindsight creates the illusion that warning signs are always obvious. They rarely are. People remember isolated arguments only after tragedy gives those memories new meaning. Casual remarks suddenly sound like threats. Strange behavior appears sinister. Ordinary disagreements become evidence of something darker. The challenge for historians and investigators alike is resisting that illusion. Not every argument predicts violence. Not every bitter divorce ends in murder. The significance of certain moments becomes clear only after the ending is already known. That is why the Lord Lucan case continues to fascinate criminologists as much as the general public. It sits at the intersection of documented fact and unanswered mystery. There are pieces of the story that investigators believe they understand with considerable confidence. There are others that remain permanently obscured by the disappearance of the central suspect. If Lord Lucan died shortly after the attack, then countless questions died with him. If he escaped and lived for decades under another identity, then he carried those answers alone for the rest of his life. Either possibility leaves history incomplete. And perhaps that incompleteness explains why the case refuses to fade. Most criminal investigations eventually arrive at a destination. Sometimes it is justice. Sometimes it is acquittal. Sometimes it is an unsolved file quietly transferred into archives where dust slowly gathers over forgotten evidence. The Lord Lucan case reached none of those endings. Instead, it entered a strange space between history and folklore. Children grew into adults hearing stories about the missing Earl. Retired detectives continued receiving letters from people convinced they possessed the breakthrough everyone else had missed. Journalists who had not even been born in 1974 found themselves retracing the same steps their predecessors had walked decades earlier. Every generation inherited the mystery. Every generation believed it might finally solve it. Yet the essential facts have remained stubbornly unchanged. A woman named Sandra Rivet never came home from work. Lady Lucan survived an attack that very nearly killed her. The man widely believed responsible disappeared before he could answer for either crime. Everything else exists somewhere along a spectrum between evidence, inference, and speculation. As we continue this story, we will separate those categories carefully. Where historical records provide clear evidence, we will follow them. Where investigators formed conclusions based on available facts, we will examine their reasoning. And where theories emerged without proof, we will treat them as exactly what they are, possibilities, not established truth. Because in a mystery that has lasted more than half a century, preserving that distinction is not simply good storytelling. It is respect. Respect for the victim whose life became overshadowed by a disappearance. Respect for the surviving family members who lived with unimaginable consequences. Respect for the investigators who pursued every credible lead available to them. And respect for the audience, who deserve the truth as far as history allows us to know it. Before the police examined bloodstains. Before newspapers published photographs of a missing aristocrat. Before anonymous phone calls claimed he had been seen thousands of miles away. There was simply a family whose private conflicts were approaching a breaking point that almost no one outside their closest circle fully understood. To understand how one November evening became one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in British criminal history, we must now leave behind the legend and return to the beginning. Not to the crime, but to the people. To the lives they had built. To the choices they made. And to the quiet, almost invisible fractures that slowly widened until they could no longer hold. The story of Lord Lucan does not truly begin with a disappearance. It begins with a family already coming apart long before anyone realized that history was watching. Richard John Bingham entered the world on December 18, 1934, carrying something that very few people are ever born with, a title that had existed long before him and was expected to survive long after he was gone. The Bingham family traced its lineage back centuries, its name woven into the fabric of the British aristocracy. To many outside that world, such a birth sounded like the opening chapter of a fairy tale. Large estates, private education, exclusive clubs. A future carefully protected by wealth and influence. It was the kind of life that newspapers described with admiration and ordinary families could only imagine from a distance. But privilege has always carried a hidden weight. When expectations are inherited, so are the pressures attached to them. Children born into noble families are often taught, long before they understand the meaning of responsibility, that they represent something larger than themselves. Every public appearance reflects upon generations of ancestors. Every success is expected. Every failure becomes unusually visible. Reputation is not merely personal, it belongs to an entire family history. Richard grew up within that invisible framework. Accounts from those who knew him in his younger years describe a boy who was intelligent, athletic, and remarkably self-assured. He attended prestigious schools where discipline, tradition, and competition shaped the daily rhythm of life. Academic performance mattered, but character mattered just as much. Young men were expected to display confidence without arrogance, composure without weakness, ambition without appearing desperate. It was an environment that rewarded emotional restraint. Problems were managed quietly. Feelings remained private. Those habits would follow many of them into adulthood. To friends, Richard often appeared charming rather than intimidating. He possessed an easy smile and a calm manner that made conversation effortless. In social settings, he knew precisely how to behave. He understood the subtle rules governing aristocratic circles because he had spent his entire life surrounded by them. There was an elegance to the way he carried himself, an ease that could not easily be imitated by someone looking in from the outside. It was this combination of confidence and natural charisma that helped him move comfortably through London's elite social scene during the 1950s and 1960s. The city itself was changing. Post-war Britain had begun shedding many of its older traditions while simultaneously clinging to them. Swinging London was becoming synonymous with fashion, music, and cultural revolution. Young artists challenged convention. Rock bands transformed global entertainment. Models, actors, and photographers redefined glamour. Yet alongside that vibrant modern culture remained another London almost untouched by those changes. Behind the polished doors of private clubs, members of the aristocracy still gathered beneath portraits of long-dead noblemen. Conversations drifted between politics, horse racing, investments, and the social calendar. Jackets remained mandatory. Manners remained formal. Reputation still opened doors that money alone could not. Richard fit naturally into that environment. Among his greatest passions was gambling. At first glance, that might sound reckless, but gambling occupied a different cultural space within Britain's upper class than it did elsewhere. Exclusive gaming clubs were social institutions as much as they were places of risk. Successful businessmen, politicians, military officers, and members of noble families regularly spent evenings around baccarat tables or card games where fortunes could quietly change hands without attracting public attention. Within those elegant rooms, confidence was almost another form of currency. Players learned to hide disappointment. Winning required composure. Losing demanded even greater composure. Richard became known as someone remarkably skilled at baccarat, a game often described as relying more upon discipline than strategy. Friends admired his ability to remain calm regardless of whether the cards favored him. He projected an image of control so convincing that many assumed it reflected the rest of his life as well. Appearances, however, are selective. The same qualities that made gambling exciting also made it dangerous. The possibility of recovering previous losses encouraged players to stay just a little longer. One fortunate night could erase months of financial pressure. One disastrous evening could create problems that lingered for years. Unlike occupations producing stable income, gambling offered emotional highs followed by equally devastating lows. Success created confidence. Confidence encouraged larger risks. Larger risks made failure increasingly expensive. For some players, the cycle remained entertainment. For others, it quietly became dependency. Historians continue debating precisely when Richard's gambling crossed that line. There is little dispute, however, that by the late 1960s financial pressures had become increasingly serious. Debts accumulated. Winning no longer consistently outweighed losing. Maintaining the appearance of effortless prosperity became progressively more difficult. Yet few people outside his closest circle fully understood the extent of those problems. That secrecy was hardly unusual. Financial embarrassment within aristocratic society often remained hidden beneath impeccable tailoring and polished conversation. One could arrive at an exclusive club dressed perfectly while privately wondering how to repay mounting obligations. Reputation depended upon maintaining appearances, even when reality had begun slipping beyond control. In 1963, Richard married Veronica Duncan. She was intelligent, elegant, and came from a respectable background. Friends remembered the early years of their marriage as outwardly happy. Together they represented the image many associated with modern British nobility. Attractive, well-connected, raising a young family while moving comfortably through London's upper social circles. Over time, 3 children were born. Photographs from those years present scenes of smiling parents and neatly dressed children, moments frozen forever before later events transformed their meaning. Looking at those images today, it is tempting to search for signs of future tragedy. There are none. Family photographs rarely reveal private suffering. A smile captured in 1 second cannot tell us what happened before the camera appeared or after it disappeared. Behind the public image, however, pressures continued building. Marriage demands compromise under the best of circumstances. Debt complicates compromise. Financial uncertainty creates tension. Long absences create distance. Resentment grows quietly until ordinary disagreements begin carrying the weight of much older frustrations. Friends later described increasing strain between Richard and Veronica, though recollections vary regarding its causes. Like many marriages that ultimately collapse, there was no single dramatic turning point visible to outsiders. Instead, small disappointments accumulated over time. Trust weakened gradually rather than suddenly. The atmosphere inside the household slowly changed. Conversations became arguments. Arguments became silence. Silence became emotional separation. For the children, daily life likely continued with routines that appeared reassuring on the surface. Meals were prepared. School schedules continued. Birthdays arrived. Holidays came and went. Children often sense tension long before adults realize how visible it has become, yet they rarely understand its origins. Parents frequently attempt to shield them from conflict. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not. As Richard spent more time pursuing gambling and social engagements, Veronica increasingly found herself carrying the practical responsibilities of maintaining family life. Whether that division emerged by necessity or choice remains debated, but witnesses consistently described growing distance between husband and wife. The marriage eventually deteriorated beyond repair. Separation followed. Then divorce. For many couples, divorce marks the conclusion of a painful chapter. For the Lukens, it became the beginning of something even more destructive. Their dispute over custody of the children evolved into a deeply personal legal battle. Court proceedings transformed private grievances into formal accusations. Every unfavorable ruling intensified emotions already running dangerously high. Custody disputes possess a unique emotional intensity because they concern not only legal rights but identity itself. Parents often interpret judicial decisions as judgments upon their worth as mothers and fathers. Losing custody can feel like losing a fundamental part of one's life. By most accounts, Richard struggled profoundly with the court's decisions. People close to him noticed increasing frustration. Some described him as obsessed with the outcome. Others remembered conversations repeatedly returning to the same perceived injustices. Whether those recollections were influenced by hindsight remains impossible to determine completely, yet they illustrate a man whose personal world appeared to be narrowing. Financial pressures remained unresolved. Family relationships continued deteriorating. The future he once expected no longer seemed guaranteed. Meanwhile, Veronica focused upon creating stability for the children despite ongoing legal conflict. Living separately did not eliminate Richard's presence from their lives. Every custody arrangement required communication. Every scheduled visit reopened emotional wounds that neither side had fully healed. It was an uneasy balance. Fragile. Temporary. Held together less by trust than by necessity. The Belgravia townhouse became more than simply a residence. It became the center of that fragile existence. Children laughed there. Meals were shared there. Arguments echoed there. A nanny named Sandra Rivet worked there. Neighbors passed by each day unaware that the elegant house concealed a family under extraordinary strain. Nothing about the exterior hinted that the address would soon become synonymous with one of the most enduring mysteries in British criminal history. For now, it remained simply another distinguished London home standing quietly beneath rows of autumn trees, while inside, lives continued moving toward a future none of its occupants could possibly imagine. From the outside, Veronica Duncan appeared to embody the elegance expected of a woman who had married into one of Britain's oldest aristocratic families. She dressed with understated sophistication, carried herself with quiet confidence, and understood the unwritten rules of high society. At formal events, photographs captured a composed smile and impeccable manners. To strangers, she looked perfectly at home among titled families, diplomats, and wealthy businessmen who populated London's exclusive social circles. But photographs never reveal the conversations that happen after guests leave. They cannot capture the silence that settles over a dining room after another argument. They cannot show the exhaustion of trying to preserve normality while a marriage slowly unravels behind closed doors. By the early 1970s, Veronica was no longer living the glamorous life that outsiders imagined. The separation from Richard had transformed daily existence into a careful balancing act between raising 3 young children and navigating an increasingly bitter legal conflict with the man she had once expected to spend the rest of her life with. Divorce was painful under any circumstances. Within aristocratic society, it carried additional complications. Every disagreement risked becoming public. Every court appearance invited attention. Friends who had once belonged comfortably to both sides quietly found themselves choosing where their loyalties lay. Some attempted to remain neutral, believing the conflict would eventually settle into an uneasy peace. Others drifted away entirely, uncomfortable with the growing hostility that now surrounded almost every interaction between the former couple. Veronica's priority, according to those who knew her, was creating stability for the children. That task was easier said than done. Children do not experience divorce only during courtroom hearings or custody exchanges. They experience it in the empty chair at dinner. They experience it when routines suddenly change. They experience it in whispered conversations that stop the moment they enter a room. Adults often believe they are protecting children by hiding conflict, but children possess a remarkable ability to sense emotional weather even when they cannot fully understand the storm. Inside the Belgravia townhouse, Veronica worked hard to maintain ordinary routines. Breakfast still had to be prepared. School uniforms still needed ironing. Homework still required supervision. Bedtime stories still mattered. Life, despite everything, continued. Helping make that possible was a woman named Sandra Rivet. Unlike the Lucans, Sandra had not been born into privilege. Her life followed a path familiar to countless working people across Britain. She understood responsibility not as an abstract virtue but as a practical necessity. Bills needed paying. Employment mattered. Reliability mattered even more. Those who remembered Sandra consistently described her as kind, dependable, and devoted to caring for children. She was the sort of person families often came to rely upon without fully realizing how essential she had become. A good nanny does far more than supervise children. She becomes part of the rhythm of the household. She learns routines, notices small changes in behavior, comforts fears, celebrates milestones, and quietly supports parents through the exhausting realities of raising a family. It is work that rarely attracts public recognition. Yet it shapes everyday life in ways that are impossible to measure. Sandra had accepted her position because it offered stability and meaningful work. There was no reason for her to imagine that employment inside an aristocratic household would one day place her at the center of one of Britain's most infamous criminal investigations. History rarely announces itself in advance. For Sandra, the Lucan residence was simply another workplace. The children knew her voice. They trusted her. She helped maintain a sense of normality while legal disputes continued unfolding around the family. Looking back from the perspective of history, there is a heartbreaking irony in that role. She had entered the household to provide care and reassurance. Instead, she would become the innocent victim caught in circumstances she neither created nor could possibly control. Meanwhile, Richard's life seemed increasingly divided between appearances and reality. To acquaintances who encountered him in London's gaming clubs, he could still appear every bit the confident aristocrat. Well-dressed, articulate, socially polished, he maintained the outward image expected of a man carrying an ancient title. The rituals of upper-class society encouraged precisely this kind of composure. Personal struggles remained private. Public confidence remained intact. Yet beneath that composed exterior, financial difficulties continued casting a long shadow. Gambling has an unusual psychological power. Unlike many destructive habits, it constantly promises redemption. Every loss appears temporary because the next game offers the possibility of recovery. Every setback whispers that one successful evening can restore everything. That promise keeps hope alive long after reason begins fading. For individuals already under emotional strain, the attraction can become even stronger. A winning streak does more than improve finances. It briefly restores confidence. It creates the comforting illusion that control has returned. When losses follow instead, disappointment often reaches far beyond money itself. There is no historical evidence that gambling alone caused the tragedy that would later unfold. Human behavior is rarely explained by a single factor. Financial pressure, emotional conflict, wounded pride, deteriorating relationships, and individual psychology all interact in ways too complex for simple conclusions. Still, investigators later examined every aspect of Richard's circumstances because understanding motive required understanding the broader context of his life. The custody dispute remained particularly significant. Court decisions concerning the children reportedly weighed heavily upon him. Friends would later tell investigators that he spoke frequently about the legal battle and appeared deeply frustrated by its outcome. As with many witness recollections gathered after major crimes, memory may have been influenced by subsequent events. Even so, The consistent picture that emerged was of a man increasingly consumed by a conflict that seemed to dominate his thinking. Veronica, meanwhile, continued attempting to establish a predictable home environment. Predictability becomes precious during periods of instability. Children benefit from routines precisely because routines suggest safety. Dinner arrives at the same time. School begins every weekday morning. Favorite books remain on the same shelf. Lights are switched off each evening. These ordinary habits quietly reassure children that, despite adult problems, their world still possesses structure. Sandra helped preserve that structure. She prepared meals. She cared for the children. She assisted with countless small tasks that made everyday family life possible. Nothing in those routines hinted at the violence waiting just beyond the horizon. Neighbors saw only fragments of the family's life. A child leaving for school. A grocery delivery. Lights glowing through windows after sunset. The townhouse itself remained elegant and orderly, its dark brick facade blending seamlessly with the distinguished architecture surrounding it. Tourists walking through Belgravia admired its beauty without knowing anything about the tensions hidden behind its walls. There is something profoundly deceptive about ordinary places connected to extraordinary crimes. After tragedy, photographs of such locations often appear strangely disappointing. Viewers expect visible signs of evil, yet they find only familiar streets, comfortable homes, and quiet neighborhoods. The setting refuses to match the horror associated with it. The Lucan residence was exactly that kind of place. It did not resemble the backdrop of a notorious mystery. It resembled home. Children laughed there. Visitors drank tea there. Household chores filled ordinary afternoons. Life moved forward in small, predictable steps. Perhaps that is why the events of November 7, 1974, shocked Britain so deeply. Violence had not erupted in an abandoned warehouse or a dangerous district known for crime. It had entered an elegant family home in one of London's most prestigious neighborhoods. The contrast unsettled people. If something so brutal could happen there, behind polished doors and expensive curtains, then perhaps violence was less predictable than society preferred to believe. As autumn settled over London, evenings arrived earlier each week. Streetlights flickered on before many workers returned home. Cold air drifted through the city's narrow streets, carrying with it the damp smell of fallen leaves and approaching winter. Inside the townhouse, preparations for another ordinary evening unfolded much as they always had. The children needed looking after. Dinner had to be finished. Household routines continued. Nothing about that particular Thursday appeared remarkable. No newspaper headline hinted at what was coming. No passerby noticed anything unusual. No neighbor sensed that history was quietly approaching. Some of the most significant moments in criminal history begin this way, not with dramatic warnings, but with complete normality. The ordinary becomes unforgettable only in retrospect. A kettle boils. A clock marks another hour. Someone walks downstairs. Only afterward do those simple actions acquire unbearable significance. Within hours, the Belgravia townhouse would cease to be merely a family residence. It would become one of the most studied crime scenes in British history. Its basement would be examined by detectives, forensic specialists, photographers, and legal experts. Its address would appear in newspapers across the world. Its occupants would forever be linked to a mystery that refused to end. But on that final ordinary evening before everything changed, it was still simply a home filled with familiar routines, quiet responsibilities, and people who believed tomorrow would arrive much like every day before it. None of them knew that the next chapter would begin not with words, but with violence. As the final weeks of 1974 unfolded, the atmosphere surrounding the Lucan family had settled into a fragile routine that looked stable only from a distance. Court hearings had come and gone. Legal documents had been filed. Arrangements concerning the children had become part of everyday life. To an outsider, it might have seemed that the worst was already behind them. The marriage had ended. Separate lives were taking shape. Time, people assumed, would eventually soften whatever bitterness remained. But time does not always heal. Sometimes it merely gives resentment more room to grow. Among those who moved within London's upper social circles, Richard Lucan remained a familiar figure. The private gaming clubs of Mayfair still welcomed him, and he continued to spend evenings in surroundings that had become almost a second home. Thick carpets muted footsteps. Crystal glasses caught the warm glow of chandeliers. Cigarette smoke drifted lazily beneath ornate ceilings while dealers shuffled cards with practiced precision. Conversations rarely became loud. Fortunes could change hands without anyone raising their voice. The atmosphere rewarded confidence. No one wanted to appear desperate. No one wanted to admit fear. To lose gracefully was almost as important as winning. Friends later remembered Richard as someone who rarely displayed emotion in public. Whether he was enjoying success or absorbing another financial setback, he often maintained the same composed expression. That ability to conceal his feelings had once been interpreted as admirable self-control. Looking back after the tragedy, some wondered whether it had also made it difficult for those around him to recognize how much internal pressure he was carrying. Such reflections are understandable, but they must also be approached with caution. Memory is shaped by outcome. After shocking events, people naturally search the past for warning signs they might have overlooked. Ordinary conversations begin to sound ominous. Casual remarks take on unexpected significance. Human beings are storytellers by nature, and we instinctively try to connect scattered moments into narratives that make sense. Reality is usually less orderly. Not every disagreement foreshadows violence. Not every troubled relationship ends in catastrophe. Yet investigators would later conclude that the conflict surrounding the Lucan family had become a central part of understanding what happened on the night of November 7th. The custody dispute was not simply a legal matter. It touched pride, identity, family, and the future. Those closest to the situation understood that emotions were running deep, even if they could not have predicted where those emotions might eventually lead. Veronica's daily life revolved around the practical realities of raising 3 children. While newspaper accounts would later focus almost entirely on titles, court proceedings, and the mysterious disappearance, ordinary family life continued in the background with little attention. Mornings began with breakfast and school preparations. Afternoons were filled with errands, household responsibilities, and the constant demands that accompany young children. Evenings settled into familiar routines designed to make the house feel safe and predictable. Sandra Rivet played an important role in maintaining that sense of stability. Her work required patience more than recognition. Like many professional caregivers, she operated quietly in the background, stepping in wherever help was needed. She was trusted with responsibilities that families reserve only for people they believe dependable. She became part of the rhythm of the household, not through dramatic moments but through countless ordinary acts of kindness and consistency. Children often form deep attachments to caregivers because reliability creates security. A familiar voice at bedtime. A reassuring smile after a nightmare. Someone who remembers favorite stories, favorite meals, and the little details adults sometimes overlook. Sandra represented that reassuring presence. It is impossible to know what she was thinking during those final ordinary days before the attack. There is no evidence that she feared for her safety or believed she was entering a dangerous environment. Everything suggests she viewed the Lucan household as her workplace, a place where she cared for children and helped keep daily life running smoothly despite the strain of an ongoing family dispute. That normality is one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the entire case. The victims did not walk knowingly toward danger. They walked into what they believed was another ordinary evening. Outside the townhouse, London continued its relentless pace. Double-decker buses rumbled through wet streets. Office workers hurried toward railway stations carrying briefcases and folded umbrellas. Shop windows glowed against the early darkness as Christmas decorations slowly began appearing across the city. Britain faced economic uncertainty, political tension, and social change, yet millions of people still found comfort in familiar routines. The Lucan family was no different. Despite private conflict, life moved forward one day at a time. Meals were prepared. Children laughed. Laundry was folded. Homework was completed. Those simple moments rarely survive in history books because they seem too ordinary to matter. Yet they matter precisely because they remind us what was about to be lost. When violent crime enters a household, it does not erase only a single evening. It destroys routines carefully built over months and years. It leaves empty places where ordinary life once existed. Afterward, even the smallest habits become painful reminders of someone who is no longer there. A favorite chair remains unoccupied. A coat still hangs by the door. A child's question receives no answer. History often remembers the sensational aspects of famous cases while overlooking these quieter consequences. The Lord Lucan mystery became famous because of a disappearance. The human tragedy began long before the disappearance captured international attention. By the first week of November, autumn had fully settled across London. Trees lining Belgravia's elegant streets had shed much of their foliage, leaving damp leaves scattered across pavements polished by intermittent rain. Darkness arrived before many families finished dinner. Windows glowed warmly against the cold evening air, creating the comforting illusion that homes offered complete protection from whatever uncertainties existed beyond their walls. The townhouse on Lower Belgrave Street appeared no different. Its exterior revealed nothing unusual. Neighbors came and went. Traffic passed by. The city breathed with its usual rhythm. No one looking at the building could have imagined that, within hours, detectives would photograph its rooms, forensic specialists would search for evidence, and reporters from around the world would gather outside its entrance. There is a peculiar silence that exists immediately before history changes. No alarms sound. No invisible line marks the final moment of normality. People continue living exactly as they always have, unaware that they are only minutes away from events that will define the rest of their lives. For the Lucan family, that silence settled over the house on the evening of Thursday, November 7, 1974. The children were home. Household routines continued. Sandra Rivet attended to her responsibilities. Veronica believed she was approaching another ordinary night. Somewhere else in London, Richard Lucan's movements that evening would later become the subject of intense scrutiny, reconstructed through witness statements, timelines, and investigative analysis. Detectives would spend years examining where he went, whom he met, and what decisions he made during those critical hours. But none of the people involved, not the victims, not the neighbors, not the police officers who would soon respond to desperate calls for help, could yet see the shape of the tragedy approaching. The story still existed only as scattered pieces waiting to collide. An old grievance. A family divided. A quiet basement. A trusted nanny. A mother preparing for another evening at home. A man whose future had become increasingly uncertain. Within the space of a single hour, those separate lives would converge in an explosion of violence that would leave one woman dead, another gravely injured, and an entire nation asking questions that, more than 50 years later, remain unanswered. The calm had lasted as long as it could. Now, the night of November 7th was about to begin. Sandra Rivet never expected to become a name remembered in British criminal history. She did not belong to an ancient family whose ancestry stretched back through centuries. She was not a celebrity, a politician, or someone whose every decision attracted newspaper attention. She was, in many ways, exactly the kind of person history too often overlooks, a hard-working woman whose life was defined not by status or wealth, but by responsibility, resilience, and the quiet determination to build a better future. Long before the world learned her name through headlines reporting a brutal murder, Sandra had already lived a life that demanded strength. She was born into an ordinary British family during a generation that understood sacrifice as a normal part of life. Britain was still rebuilding after the devastation of the Second World War. Opportunities existed, but very few arrived without effort. Families valued stability, steady employment, and reliability because those qualities made the difference between security and uncertainty. People who knew Sandra later described her in remarkably similar ways. She was dependable, gentle, patient. Someone who rarely sought attention for herself. She possessed the kind of quiet kindness that often goes unnoticed precisely because it never asks to be noticed. If someone needed help, Sandra offered it without expecting recognition. If work needed doing, she simply got on with it. She was practical rather than dramatic, thoughtful rather than outspoken, the sort of person who made difficult days easier for those around her. These qualities eventually led her toward childcare. Looking after children requires far more than affection. It demands consistency. Children quickly recognize whether an adult can be trusted. They notice who remembers promises, who listens carefully, and who remains calm when everything around them feels chaotic. Sandra earned that trust. For her, caring for children was not merely employment. It was responsibility. Every morning carried familiar routines. Breakfasts prepared before school. Coats buttoned against the cold. Forgotten books retrieved at the last moment. Tears comforted after scraped knees. Stories read before bedtime. None of these moments would ever appear in newspapers, yet together they formed the quiet foundation upon which countless families relied. By the early 1970s, Sandra had accepted employment with Veronica, Lady Lucan. From the outside, the opportunity may have appeared attractive. The household belonged to a distinguished aristocratic family living in one of London's most prestigious neighborhoods. The children needed dependable care. The position offered stability, regular work, and the chance to support a family navigating difficult circumstances. Sandra stepped into that role with the same professionalism that had defined the rest of her life. She was not hired to become involved in legal disputes. She was not expected to mediate family conflict. Her responsibility was much simpler. Care for the children. Help maintain the household. Provide the sense of security that children desperately need when the adults around them are struggling. Those responsibilities became especially important after the separation between Richard and Veronica. Divorce changes the emotional climate of a home even when parents work tirelessly to protect their children. Routines become anchors. Familiar faces become sources of reassurance. Caregivers often find themselves offering comfort not through grand gestures, but through ordinary consistency. Breakfast arrives on time. School uniforms are ready. Favorite bedtime stories remain unchanged. Life continues. Sandra became part of that stability. The Lucan children knew her voice. They trusted her presence. Within the walls of the Belgravia townhouse, she represented something dependable during a period when much else felt uncertain. Those who have worked as nannies or professional caregivers often describe an unusual position within family life. They become deeply involved in a household while remaining, in some respects, outsiders. They witness birthdays, illnesses, celebrations, arguments, and quiet everyday moments. They learn family routines intimately, yet they also maintain professional boundaries, understanding that the family's private conflicts are not theirs to solve. Sandra occupied exactly that delicate position. She was close enough to care. Far enough removed that many of the deeper emotional battles remained beyond her control. There is no credible evidence suggesting that she anticipated personal danger. Nothing indicates that she believed she had become the focus of anyone's anger or resentment. Everything known about her final days suggests that she expected life to continue as it always had. She would go to work, care for the children, return home, begin again the following day. History can be unbearably cruel in the randomness of its choices. Some people become victims because they are deliberately targeted. Others become victims simply because they happen to stand where violence unexpectedly erupts. Investigators would later consider the possibility that Sandra was not the intended target of the attack. If that assessment is correct, then her death becomes even more tragic. It means her life was taken not because of who she was, but because of where she happened to be at one particular moment. A single decision. Walking downstairs. Nothing more. The difference between life and death may have been measured in seconds. That possibility forces us to confront one of the most unsettling realities of violent crime. Not every tragedy follows destiny. Sometimes it follows timing. Sandra's story reminds us that history's most famous cases are often built upon ordinary lives interrupted without warning. While the public became fascinated by aristocratic titles, mysterious disappearances, and international manhunts, the woman whose death made the entire investigation possible gradually faded into the background of public memory. That imbalance deserves correcting. Because without Sandra Rivet, there is no Lord Lucan mystery. There is simply another difficult divorce among Britain's upper class. Her death transformed private conflict into national tragedy. Yet newspapers naturally devoted far more attention to the missing Earl than to the woman who never had the opportunity to tell her own story. This pattern repeats throughout criminal history. The accused often become infamous. The victims become footnotes. True justice demands remembering both. Sandra had family. People who cared whether she came home. People who waited for phone calls that would never arrive. People forced to learn that someone they loved had become the center of a crime investigation whose consequences would stretch across decades. For them, the mystery surrounding Lord Lucan was never an intellectual puzzle. It was personal loss. Every anniversary reopened old wounds. Every newspaper article speculating about new sightings reminded them that the man suspected of involvement had never stood in court to answer questions about what happened that night. There would be no cross-examination. No guilty verdict delivered before a packed courtroom. No final explanation. Only absence. As years passed, Sandra's name risked becoming overshadowed by the extraordinary disappearance that followed her death. Yet those who study the case carefully often return to the same realization. Strip away the mystery. Ignore the rumors. Forget the countless alleged sightings across continents. At the center remains a woman who left for work expecting an ordinary day and never returned. That truth should never become secondary. It is tempting, when examining famous mysteries, to become consumed by unanswered questions. Human beings naturally seek solutions. We want to know where Lord Lucan went. We want to understand whether he died shortly afterward or lived for decades under another identity. We want every loose end neatly tied together. But there is another question that deserves equal attention. Who was Sandra Rivet before history reduced her to the phrase the victim? She was more than evidence. More than a newspaper headline. More than a name listed in court records. She was a daughter. A friend. A caregiver trusted by children. A woman building an ordinary life through honest work. Those identities existed long before the events of November 7, 1974. And they deserve to be remembered long after the mystery itself is finally solved, if it is ever solved at all. Because in every true crime story, there comes a moment when history chooses what it will remember. In the Lord Lucan case, the world remembered the disappearance. This story also chooses to remember the woman whose life was stolen before the mystery had even begun. If Sandra Rivet represented the quiet heart of the household, Veronica, Lady Lucan, carried the impossible responsibility of holding what remained of her family together while the foundations beneath it continued to shift. By the autumn of 1974, she was no longer simply a divorced aristocrat living in one of London's most exclusive neighborhoods. She was a mother trying to create stability in a home where uncertainty had become a permanent guest. Each morning demanded decisions that had nothing to do with newspaper headlines or legal arguments. The children needed breakfast. School uniforms had to be checked. Appointments had to be remembered. The ordinary details of family life refused to pause simply because a marriage had collapsed. Friends later described Veronica as increasingly exhausted during this period. The emotional toll of the custody dispute, combined with the practical demands of raising 3 young children, had left its mark. Yet those who spent time with her also remembered determination. Whatever difficulties existed between her and Richard, she remained focused on protecting her children from the conflict as much as possible. It was not an easy task. Children often ask questions adults cannot answer. Why doesn't Daddy live here anymore? When will things go back to normal? Can we all be together again? There are no perfect responses to questions like these because they come from a place where legal explanations mean nothing. A child does not understand court rulings or custody agreements. A child understands only absence. Veronica found herself navigating those emotional realities while also managing the practical demands of everyday life. The Belgravia townhouse, elegant though it appeared from the outside, had become both a sanctuary and a reminder. Within its walls lived the children she was fighting to protect. Within those same walls lingered memories of a marriage that had steadily unraveled. Every room carried echoes of the past. The dining room had once hosted family meals attended by both parents. The staircase had heard children's laughter during happier years. The sitting room had welcomed guests who admired what they believed was a successful aristocratic family. Now those same spaces held a different atmosphere. Not one of constant fear, but of quiet tension. Life continued, yet something essential had been lost. Sandra's presence helped soften that reality. Professional caregivers often become emotional anchors without realizing it. Their consistency provides reassurance not only for children but also for overwhelmed parents. Veronica knew that when household responsibilities multiplied beyond what one person could reasonably manage, Sandra could be trusted to step in with calm efficiency. That trust cannot be built overnight. It develops through countless ordinary moments. A child comforted after a nightmare. A scraped knee cleaned without panic. Homework patiently supervised. Meals prepared with little fuss. Sandra became woven into the fabric of daily life so naturally that it was easy to forget she had once been a newcomer to the household. Outside the home, however, another reality continued unfolding. Richard Lucan's financial situation remained under increasing pressure. Although the precise extent of his debts has been debated over the years, contemporary accounts consistently describe a man whose gambling had become a serious source of personal strain. Winning nights offered temporary relief. Losing nights deepened existing problems. There is a psychological trap unique to gambling. Unlike other financial losses, gambling losses often appear reversible. The next hand. The next race. The next game. Hope survives because recovery always seems just one fortunate moment away. For some people, that possibility becomes irresistible. For others, it becomes destructive. Whether Richard believed he could eventually regain control of both his finances and his personal life remains impossible to know. What is clear is that, by late 1974, neither appeared to be moving in the direction he wanted. The custody battle had not produced the outcome he desired. His marriage had ended. Financial pressures persisted. The image of effortless aristocratic success was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Yet to casual acquaintances, much of that struggle remained invisible. He still dressed impeccably. He still appeared in familiar social circles. He still carried himself with the confidence expected of a titled gentleman. The contrast between public appearance and private reality would later become one of the defining themes of the case. So much about the Lucan story revolves around surfaces. An elegant townhouse concealing emotional conflict. An aristocrat hiding financial difficulties. A respected family living through a deeply painful separation. A seemingly ordinary Thursday evening that would become one of the most infamous nights in British criminal history. Appearances delayed recognition. They allowed outsiders to believe that, despite the divorce, life had settled into a workable routine. Perhaps, in some ways, it had. Conflict does not consume every waking hour. Even troubled families laugh together sometimes. Children still play. Birthdays are celebrated. Television programs are watched after dinner. Life has an extraordinary ability to continue alongside unhappiness. That was true inside the Lucan household as well. The children remained the emotional center of everything. Although history remembers their parents because of the tragedy that followed, it is important to remember that 3 young lives were also permanently altered. They would grow up carrying memories shaped not only by the events of one terrible evening but by the decades of mystery that followed. Every newspaper article. Every television documentary. Every anniversary revisiting the disappearance. Their family history became public property. Very few people can imagine what that feels like. To lose privacy at the same moment you lose security. To see strangers debate the actions of your parents as though discussing fictional characters rather than real human beings. The children had no choice in any of it. Neither did Sandra. Neither, ultimately, did Veronica. That distinction matters. History often focuses on the decisions made by central figures while overlooking everyone else whose lives were transformed by those decisions. The Lord Lucan case is no exception. By the beginning of November, autumn evenings arrived quickly. Around the townhouse, trees had surrendered most of their leaves, leaving damp pavements scattered with shades of brown and gold. Streetlights flickered to life before dinner. Curtains were drawn against the chill. Families throughout Belgravia settled into familiar nighttime routines, largely unaware of one another's private lives. From the street, the Lucan residence looked no different from its neighbors. Warm lights glowed behind windows. The polished front door reflected the soft amber of nearby lamps. Passing motorists had no reason to glance twice. Nothing suggested that the house stood on the edge of history. Inside, life followed its usual rhythm. The children depended on familiar routines. Sandra carried out her responsibilities with the same quiet professionalism she always had. Veronica focused on maintaining calm despite the pressures surrounding her. Elsewhere in London, Richard continued moving through a city that had no idea his name would soon dominate newspaper headlines around the world. There are moments in every true crime story when ordinary life reaches its final, unnoticed chapter. No one realizes it at the time. No clock announces it. No invisible line separates peace from catastrophe. People simply continue doing what they have always done. Preparing dinner. Putting children to bed. Answering the telephone. Walking downstairs. Only later do those ordinary actions acquire enormous emotional weight. The tragedy of the Lord Lucan case is rooted in exactly that transformation. A normal evening became a historic crime scene. A trusted nanny became a murder victim. A mother became a survivor. An aristocrat became one of the world's most famous fugitives. And an elegant London townhouse became forever associated with a mystery that would outlive nearly everyone who witnessed its beginning. By the evening of November 7, 1974, every piece was already in place. The house stood quiet beneath the cold London sky. Its occupants believed they were approaching another ordinary night. None of them could have imagined that, within the hour, the life they recognized would cease to exist, replaced by violence, loss, and questions that more than half a century later still refused to disappear. The tragedy of the Lucan case is often described as a mystery about a missing aristocrat. It is framed around a vanished lord, a disputed identity, and decades of unanswered questions. But before there was a missing man, before there were international rumors and countless reported sightings, there was a family caught in the middle of a devastating collapse. And at the center of that family was a mother. Veronica Duncan, later known as Lady Lucan, was a woman whose life changed dramatically when the private struggles of her marriage became impossible to contain. Her story is not simply one of survival on a single night in November 1974. It is also the story of a person who spent years living through emotional conflict, public scrutiny, and the painful reality of seeing a once promising future disappear. When she first met Richard Bingham, there was little reason to believe their relationship would become associated with one of Britain's most infamous criminal mysteries. At the beginning, there was attraction. There was excitement. There was the promise of a shared future. Like many couples, they entered marriage believing that affection and commitment would be enough to overcome difficulties. They came from a world where expectations were high and appearances mattered. Their wedding represented not only a personal union but a merging of social circles, family histories, and ambitions. In photographs from their earlier years together, they looked like a couple from another era. Young. Elegant. Confident. They belonged to a world of formal dinners, country weekends, and social events where clothing, manners, and reputation carried great importance. Friends and acquaintances saw a couple who seemed to fit naturally within the environment surrounding them. But relationships are lived away from cameras. The private reality of marriage rarely resembles the version presented to the outside world. Over time, pressures accumulated. Richard's gambling created financial concerns. His personality, shaped by competition and a desire for control, increasingly collided with the realities of family life. Veronica faced the demands of raising children while the relationship she depended upon became less stable. The distance between them grew gradually. There was no single moment that explained everything. No single argument that transformed happiness into hostility. Instead, their marriage appears to have deteriorated through repeated disappointments, unresolved conflicts, and growing emotional separation. By the time they separated, the relationship had become deeply damaged. But separation did not bring peace. Instead, it introduced a new struggle. The children. Custody disputes are among the most emotionally charged conflicts any family can experience because they are not simply disagreements about arrangements. They involve fears, identities, and the most personal question a parent can face: what role will I have in my child's life? For Veronica, maintaining custody meant preserving the stability she believed her children needed. For Richard, losing control over that aspect of family life appeared to represent a profound personal defeat. The legal battle intensified the existing conflict. Courtrooms transformed private pain into official records. Arguments that once existed behind closed doors became part of formal proceedings. Every statement carried consequences. Every decision affected not only the parents but 3 children who had no control over the situation surrounding them. This period placed Veronica under enormous pressure. She was not only dealing with the end of her marriage. She was managing the emotional needs of her children while facing continued contact with someone with whom communication had become increasingly difficult. The world around her continued expecting normal behavior. Society often has particular expectations of people from privileged backgrounds. There can be an assumption that wealth creates protection from ordinary suffering. But emotional pain does not disappear because someone lives in an expensive house. Fear does not respect social status. A family crisis remains a family crisis regardless of the address. Inside the Belgravia townhouse, Veronica attempted to create a sense of normality. That meant relying on routines. It meant ensuring the children felt secure. It meant accepting help when needed. Sandra Rivet became part of that effort. The relationship between employer and nanny is often misunderstood by those unfamiliar with domestic work. A nanny is not simply someone hired to perform tasks. In many households, particularly those with young children, that person becomes a trusted presence who witnesses the most personal parts of family life. Sandra knew the rhythms of the household. She knew the children's personalities. She understood what made them laugh, what frightened them, and what comforted them. Her role placed her close enough to observe the family, but not close enough to control the conflicts affecting it. She was there to help maintain daily life. Nothing more. Nothing less. That distinction is important because after the crime occurred, public attention naturally focused on the relationship between Richard and Veronica. The argument surrounding their marriage became the center of investigation. Yet Sandra's presence in the home was not connected to those disputes. She was simply doing her job. She was simply present. And that ordinary presence would become the reason her name became forever linked to the case. One of the cruelest realities of criminal history is that victims are sometimes remembered only through the circumstances of their deaths. Their personalities, hopes, and everyday lives become secondary to the event that ended them. Sandra deserved more than that. She deserved to be remembered as a person. Veronica deserved more than being described only as the woman who survived an attack. She was a mother, a daughter, a woman whose entire future was altered in a matter of minutes. The aftermath would bring consequences that extended far beyond physical injuries. Surviving a violent crime does not mean returning to the life that existed before. The world after such an event is permanently changed. The home that once represented family became a reminder of trauma. The street where she lived became associated with cameras and reporters. Her private life became a subject of national discussion. Every statement she made would be examined. Every memory she shared would be questioned. Every decision would be analyzed by strangers who had never experienced what she had endured. That burden continued long after the immediate danger ended. Meanwhile, the man at the center of the allegations disappeared. And that disappearance created a unique form of uncertainty. If a suspect is arrested, society expects a process. Evidence is presented. Witnesses testify. Arguments are made. A verdict is reached. But when a suspect vanishes, the people connected to the crime are left with a different kind of unfinished reality. There is no final conversation. No definitive explanation. No courtroom moment where accountability is demanded. Instead, questions remain suspended indefinitely. For Veronica, the mystery surrounding Richard Lucan was not an entertaining puzzle. It was connected directly to the most traumatic event of her life. Every new theory about his possible survival reopened public attention. Every alleged sighting brought renewed discussion. Every documentary or newspaper article returned the story to the spotlight. For the rest of the world, Lord Lucan became an extraordinary mystery. For those closest to the victims, he represented an unresolved chapter that had never truly closed. That difference defines the human side of this case. A missing person story can fascinate millions. A victim's story affects those who loved them forever. As November 1974 approached its final weeks, no one outside the household could see the collision of events approaching. The family conflict. The emotional pressure. The fragile routines. The ordinary evening responsibilities. All of these existed quietly beneath the surface. The townhouse remained standing. The lights still came on each evening. Neighbors continued walking past without suspicion. The world continued turning. But inside that home lived people whose lives were moving toward a moment they would never forget. A moment that would transform Sandra Rivet from a caregiver into a victim remembered by history. A moment that would transform Veronica from a mother trying to protect her children into the survivor at the center of a national investigation. A moment that would transform Richard Lucan from a wealthy aristocrat into one of the most mysterious figures in modern British crime. And as the evening of November 7th arrived, the final hours of their old lives were already beginning. They simply did not know it yet. The evening of Thursday, November 7th, 1974, began like countless evenings before it. There was no dramatic warning. No strange message left behind. No moment when anyone inside the Lucan household looked around and realized that something terrible was about to happen. That is what makes the events of that night so disturbing. The most devastating moments in human history rarely announce themselves before arriving. They enter quietly, hidden inside ordinary routines. A person finishes a conversation. Someone prepares a meal. A child asks an innocent question. A clock moves forward 1 minute at a time. And then, suddenly, everything changes. On that cold November evening, the elegant townhouse on Lower Belgrave Street appeared exactly as it always had. The exterior gave no indication that anything unusual was happening behind its walls. The brick facade stood beneath the dim London sky. The windows glowed softly against the darkness. The neighborhood remained calm, sheltered behind the image of wealth and respectability that had defined Belgravia for generations. To anyone walking past, it was simply another beautiful home in one of London's most prestigious districts. Inside, however, the atmosphere was one of quiet domestic activity. The children were at home. The household was moving through the familiar rhythm of another evening. Sandra Rivet was carrying out the responsibilities she had performed many times before. She was not there because of the family's legal problems. She was not there because she wanted to be part of anyone's personal conflict. She was there because children needed care and a household needed support. That distinction would become one of the most painful aspects of the case. Sandra was not a participant in the conflict surrounding the Lucan marriage. She was not involved in the custody battle. She was not responsible for the anger and resentment that had developed between two people who were once husband and wife. She was simply doing her job. The exact sequence of events inside the house has been reconstructed from surviving testimony, forensic examination, and later investigations. Some details remain uncertain, as they do in many cases where the central suspect disappears before a full trial can examine every piece of evidence. But the broad outline is clear. Sometime during the evening, Sandra went downstairs to the basement. It was a completely ordinary action. In a large London townhouse, basements were practical spaces. They contained household supplies, storage areas, and items needed for daily life. Going downstairs was not an unusual decision. It was not a risky choice. It was simply part of maintaining a home. Yet in criminal investigations, ordinary actions can become permanent markers in time. Before. After. The moment someone enters a room. The moment a door closes. The moment a life changes forever. Sandra entered the basement and encountered a situation she could never have expected. Investigators later concluded that she was attacked with a length of lead piping. The violence was sudden and severe. There was no evidence that she had time to prepare for what was happening. The attack appears to have been swift, leaving her unable to escape or call for help. The basement, a place associated with routine household tasks, became the scene of a violent crime. The contrast is haunting. A room designed for storage and ordinary chores became the final place Sandra would ever see. The person who entered that basement was a woman whose life had been built around caring for others. Her final moments were not spent in danger she had chosen. They were spent in a place where she should have been safe. The details of the attack are difficult to consider, not because they are mysterious, but because of how abruptly an ordinary life ended. Sandra had plans beyond that evening. She had relationships beyond that house. She had memories that existed long before her name appeared in newspapers. The violence erased all of those future possibilities in an instant. But the night was not over. Above the basement, the house remained unaware of the full horror that had occurred below. Eventually, Veronica descended. The circumstances surrounding her arrival in the basement would become central to the investigation. According to her later account, she encountered the attacker there. What followed was a terrifying struggle that would determine whether she survived or became another victim. The attack against Veronica was brutal. She was struck repeatedly, suffering injuries to her head and face. The force of the assault was enough to create a situation where survival depended not only on physical resistance but on instinct and determination. In moments of extreme danger, the human mind can react in ways that are difficult to understand afterward. Time changes. The world narrows. Thought becomes secondary to survival. A person does not think about what is logical. They think about escaping. Veronica fought back. Despite the shock, despite the injuries, despite the fear of what had already happened, she resisted. At one point during the struggle, she bit her attacker. It was an act of desperation. A human reaction from someone refusing to surrender. That single act would later become one of the significant details examined by investigators because it suggested that the attacker and victim had been in close physical contact. For Veronica, however, it was not evidence. It was survival. The struggle continued. Somehow, she managed to escape. Bleeding and injured, she moved away from the immediate danger and out of the house. The person who had attacked her remained behind, but the threat was still very real. She did not know whether the attacker would follow. She did not know whether anyone else inside the house was safe. She only knew she needed help. The image of Veronica leaving that townhouse would become one of the most powerful images associated with the case. A woman from a wealthy and respected family, suddenly stripped of every appearance of privilege, standing in the street not as a member of the aristocracy but simply as a wounded person desperately seeking assistance. In that moment, titles meant nothing. Social status meant nothing. Only survival mattered. She reached the nearby home of neighbors and asked for help. When the door opened, the people inside were confronted with a scene they could never have imagined. The woman standing before them was injured, frightened, and covered in blood. The calm image of Belgravia respectability had been shattered. Emergency services were called. The quiet evening transformed into a scene of urgency. Questions began immediately. What had happened inside? Was the attacker still nearby? Were the children safe? Was anyone else injured? The answers would reveal a tragedy far greater than anyone first understood. Inside the Lucan residence, police would soon discover the body of Sandra Rivett. The possibility that this was not merely an assault but a murder investigation became undeniable. A family home had become a crime scene. A mother had become a survivor. A caregiver had become a victim. And somewhere beyond the immediate chaos, one man connected to the household was already moving away from the center of the investigation. Richard Lucan. His actions that night would soon become the subject of intense scrutiny. Where had he been? What had he known? Why did he disappear? Those questions would dominate headlines for decades. But at the moment emergency responders arrived, there was only confusion. There was no certainty about what would happen next. No one knew that the investigation would eventually become one of Britain's greatest unsolved mysteries. No one knew that the suspect would vanish. No one knew that rumors of survival would continue for generations. At that moment, there was only a crime scene, a grieving family, a wounded survivor, and the beginning of a search for answers that would never truly end. The moments immediately following the attack were filled with confusion, fear, and desperate attempts to understand what had happened inside the townhouse on Lower Belgrave Street. For the neighbors who opened their door that night, there was no preparation for what they were about to witness. Belgravia was known for quiet streets and carefully maintained homes. It was the kind of neighborhood where curtains were drawn early, where residents recognized familiar faces, and where the sounds of daily life rarely suggested danger. The area carried an atmosphere of security, almost as if the elegance of its surroundings could protect those living within them. But violence does not respect appearances. It does not stop at expensive doors. It does not avoid prestigious neighborhoods. When Veronica Lucan arrived at her neighbor's home, the image they saw was not that of an aristocratic woman from a famous family. They saw a person in distress. A person who had just escaped something terrifying. A person whose immediate concern was not reputation, wealth, or social standing, but survival. The neighbors acted quickly. They provided assistance. They contacted the authorities. And within minutes, the quiet residential street became filled with activity. Police vehicles arrived. Emergency personnel moved toward the house. Questions were asked before anyone had enough information to answer them. The first priority was simple. Find out what happened. Make sure everyone was safe. Stop any continuing threat. But as officers entered the townhouse, they began to realize they were dealing with something far more serious than a violent domestic incident. The interior told a story of sudden chaos. A home designed around comfort and family life had become the scene of a violent struggle. The contrast would later be one of the most disturbing elements of the investigation. The rooms were not abandoned. They were not hidden away in some remote location. They belonged to a family. They contained the ordinary evidence of everyday existence. The crime had interrupted normal life rather than replacing it. That is often what makes violent crime scenes so unsettling. The objects remain. The people do not. A child's belongings may still be where they were left. A coat may still hang near the entrance. A cup may still sit in the place where someone last used it. The world appears frozen, while the lives within it have been permanently changed. As officers moved through the house, they discovered the basement area where Sandra Rivett had been attacked. The reality of the situation became clear. This was a murder investigation. A woman who had entered the basement during the course of her work had lost her life there. The discovery immediately changed the nature of the emergency response. This was no longer simply about protecting a survivor. It was now about preserving evidence, understanding the sequence of events, and identifying the person responsible. Every second mattered. Every detail mattered. Because somewhere beyond that house, the person investigators believed responsible had already left. The attack had created one of the most challenging situations any detective can face. A serious crime. a surviving witness, physical evidence, but no suspect in custody. At first, investigators needed to understand the timeline. The sequence of events would become the foundation of everything that followed. They needed to determine when Sandra had entered the basement, when Veronica had encountered the attacker, how the attacker had entered and exited the house, and what had happened during the period immediately after the assault. These questions were not simply procedural. They were the difference between theory and fact. A criminal investigation is often a race against time. Evidence can disappear. Memories can change. Opportunities to locate a suspect can vanish quickly. In this case, the urgency was even greater because the person investigators would soon focus upon was not an unknown stranger. He was someone connected directly to the household. Someone whose name carried enormous public attention. Richard Lucan. The possibility that Lord Lucan himself could be involved seemed almost impossible to many people when the news first began spreading. A member of the aristocracy. A man from one of Britain's most recognizable social circles. Someone who moved among wealthy and influential people. The idea that such a person could become the focus of a murder investigation challenged many assumptions about class, reputation, and privilege. Yet investigators were not guided by reputation. They were guided by evidence. And evidence was already beginning to point toward uncomfortable questions. Veronica's account would become central. She identified her attacker as Richard Lucan. Her statement provided investigators with a direct connection between the crime and the man who had recently been her husband. But identifying someone known to you in a traumatic situation is complex. Investigators had to examine every detail carefully. They had to consider the circumstances, the lighting, the stress of the encounter, and the physical evidence available. A victim's statement is powerful. But in criminal investigations, it is only one piece of a much larger puzzle. The puzzle would soon include Richard's movements that evening. Witness accounts. Vehicle evidence. Letters. Physical items recovered after his disappearance. Each piece would contribute to the growing picture of what investigators believed had happened. But before those details emerged, the immediate concern remained the same. Where was Richard Lucan? The question appeared almost immediately. If he was involved, he needed to be found. If he was not involved, he needed to be located so investigators could eliminate him as a suspect. Either way, his absence created a problem. A missing suspect cannot answer questions. A missing suspect cannot provide an explanation. A missing suspect cannot participate in the process that determines guilt or innocence. The search began. Across London, officers started attempting to locate him. Friends and associates were contacted. Possible locations were checked. His movements were reconstructed. But the man at the center of the investigation had already begun moving into the shadows. The events that followed would transform the case from a murder investigation into something far stranger. Because most investigations follow a familiar path. A crime occurs. A suspect is identified. Police make an arrest. Evidence is presented. A trial begins. The public eventually receives a conclusion. The Lord Lucan case refused to follow that pattern. Instead, it created a question that has remained unanswered for generations. How does a person disappear from a modern country like Britain? A country with police networks, border controls, friends, family, financial records. A person with a famous name should be easier to find, not harder. Yet within hours, Richard Lucan would begin a journey that would end with his complete disappearance from public view. That fact would later become almost as famous as the crime itself. But on the night of November 7th, investigators were still focused on the immediate reality. A woman was dead. Another woman was injured. 3 children had been caught in the aftermath of unimaginable violence. And somewhere beyond the streets of London, a man who could potentially provide the answers was no longer where anyone expected him to be. The house that had once represented family life had become the starting point of a mystery. Every room would be examined. Every object would be considered. Every timeline would be questioned. And every action taken by Richard Lucan after leaving that house would be analyzed repeatedly for decades. Because the crime itself lasted only minutes. The search for the truth would last a lifetime. The attack inside the Lucan townhouse lasted only a short period of time, but its consequences would continue for generations. That is one of the most unsettling realities of violent crime. The moment itself can be brief. The damage can be permanent. For Sandra Rivett, there would be no recovery, no opportunity to explain what she experienced, no chance to tell her own version of events. Her life ended in a place where she had gone as part of her ordinary responsibilities. She had entered the basement as a caregiver, a worker, and a trusted member of a household. She never left. For Veronica Lucan, survival came with a different kind of burden. Escaping the attack did not mean escaping its consequences. The physical injuries would heal over time, but the memory of that night would remain. The house where she had lived with her children was no longer simply a home. It had become the location of a traumatic event that would define the rest of her life. And for Richard Lucan, the hours after the attack would transform him from a troubled aristocrat into one of the most discussed missing persons in modern British history. But before the mystery of his disappearance began, investigators had to understand the violence that occurred inside those walls. Crime scenes do not speak. They do not explain themselves. They leave fragments. A mark on a surface. A position of an object. A trace of blood. A damaged item. A witness statement. Investigators must take those fragments and rebuild the story of what happened. Inside the Lucan home, every detail mattered. The basement became the center of the investigation. It was where the first and most devastating part of the attack had occurred. Specialists examined the area carefully, attempting to understand the sequence of events. They studied the injuries, the location of evidence, and the relationship between the basement and the rest of the house. The questions were endless. Was the attacker waiting? Was the basement chosen intentionally? Was Sandra mistaken for someone else? Had the attack unfolded exactly as planned, or had something unexpected changed the course of events? Some questions would remain unanswered forever. That uncertainty became one of the defining characteristics of the case. Investigators could establish many facts. They could establish who was dead. They could establish who survived. They could establish who was missing. But understanding the exact thoughts and intentions of the person responsible was far more difficult. Human beings leave physical evidence. They rarely leave behind their true motivations. One of the most debated aspects of the attack was the relationship between the two victims. Sandra and Veronica were connected only through the household where they both happened to be that night. Their lives were completely different. One was a mother and aristocrat involved in a bitter divorce. The other was a working woman providing care and support for a family. Yet inside that house, their paths crossed in the most tragic way imaginable. The possibility that Sandra was not the intended target has remained one of the most disturbing elements of the case. If the attacker was looking for Veronica, then Sandra's death represented a horrifying mistake. A person who entered the wrong room. A person who appeared at the wrong moment. A person whose life was taken because of circumstances beyond her control. Such possibilities are difficult to accept because they challenge our desire to believe that tragedy follows some understandable pattern. We want victims and offenders to be connected. We want motives to make sense. We want actions to have a clear explanation. But sometimes innocent people become trapped in conflicts they never created. Sandra's death became a reminder of that painful reality. Meanwhile, Veronica's escape created the possibility of answers. Survivors often become the most important witnesses in criminal investigations because they can provide information no physical evidence can reveal. They can describe movements, voices, actions, and details that investigators would otherwise never know. But surviving a violent attack also creates unique challenges. Memory under extreme stress is complicated. Fear changes perception. Trauma affects how moments are recorded in the mind. A few seconds can feel like hours. A face can become unforgettable. A sound can remain vivid for decades. Veronica's account would become central to the case, and investigators would examine every detail carefully. Her description of the attacker, the struggle, and the events leading up to her escape would influence the direction of the investigation from the beginning. But even with a survivor's testimony, police still needed more. They needed physical evidence. They needed to understand Richard Lucan's movements. They needed to locate him. Because one of the greatest challenges in any investigation is turning suspicion into proof. And proof requires a process. It requires questioning. It requires examination. It requires the opportunity for the accused person to respond. The disappearance of Richard Lucan prevented that process from happening. The case was immediately transformed. Instead of asking only, what happened inside the house? Investigators also had to ask, where did the person connected to this crime go? The answer was not simple. Richard was not a person without connections. He had friends. He had money. He had social relationships across influential circles. He knew how to move within a world where privacy was highly valued and personal matters were often handled discreetly. Those advantages would later fuel countless theories about whether he received assistance after the attack. Some people believed he had friends willing to help him escape. Others argued that his disappearance was simply the desperate action of a man who realized he was facing devastating consequences. Some believed he died shortly after leaving London. Others believed he survived and created a new life somewhere far away. Each theory attempted to solve the same impossible problem. A man had vanished. But on that first night, investigators did not yet know the scale of the mystery they were facing. They were not thinking about decades of speculation. They were not thinking about documentaries, books, and newspaper investigations that would appear long into the future. They were dealing with the immediate aftermath of a violent crime. A victim had to be identified and protected. Evidence had to be preserved. A suspect had to be located. A family had to be informed that their lives had changed forever. Outside the townhouse, reporters were beginning to gather. The name Lord Lucan carried immediate public interest. Britain had seen criminal cases involving famous people before, but rarely one where aristocracy, violence, and disappearance were combined so dramatically. The story contained every element capable of capturing public attention. A nobleman. A troubled marriage. A murder. A surviving victim. A missing suspect. The public fascination began almost immediately. But behind the headlines were people dealing with consequences far more personal than newspaper stories could describe. Sandra's family faced unimaginable grief. Veronica faced recovery and uncertainty. The children faced a future shaped by an event they did not choose. The police faced a case unlike anything they had previously handled. And somewhere beyond the immediate search area, Richard Lucan was moving toward a fate that remains unknown. The night that began as an ordinary Thursday evening had become a turning point. Before November 7, 1974, Richard Lucan was known as a wealthy aristocrat with personal problems. After November 7, 1974, he became something else. A mystery. A name attached to questions. A man whose absence became almost as famous as the crime itself. But the most important fact remained unchanged. Before there was a mystery, there was violence. Before there was a missing person, there were victims. And before the world began searching for Lord Lucan, two women inside a London townhouse experienced the horror that would create one of Britain's most enduring criminal mysteries. In the early hours after the attack, the elegant townhouse on Lower Belgrave Street became the focus of one of the most intense criminal investigations Britain had seen in decades. Only hours earlier, it had been a private home. A place where children slept. A place where meals were prepared. A place where a family attempted to continue living despite personal conflict and uncertainty. Now it was a crime scene. The transformation was sudden and devastating. Police officers moved carefully through rooms that still carried traces of ordinary life. The contrast between the familiar and the horrific created an atmosphere that investigators would never forget. There was no dramatic separation between normality and tragedy. The evidence of everyday existence remained everywhere, existing alongside the evidence of violence. That is what made the scene so disturbing. A crime had not occurred in some distant, abandoned location. It had happened inside a home. Inside a place designed to provide safety. Inside a space where people should have felt protected. As investigators began their work, they faced the difficult task of reconstructing a sequence of events from incomplete information. The attacker was gone. One victim was dead. Another was seriously injured. The only person who could potentially provide a full explanation had disappeared. Every investigation begins with questions. This one began with hundreds. What exactly happened in the basement? How did the attacker enter the house? How long had the attack lasted? Was Sandra Rivet the intended victim? Was Veronica targeted from the beginning? Where was Richard Lucan? And perhaps the most urgent question of all. Could he be found before he disappeared permanently? The police response quickly shifted from emergency action to investigation. Officers secured the property, ensuring that evidence was protected from contamination. Specialists began examining the scene in detail, searching for anything that could reveal the identity or movements of the attacker. At the time, forensic science was far less advanced than it is today. There was no widespread DNA profiling. No modern databases capable of instantly comparing biological evidence. No sophisticated digital tracking systems. Investigators depended on traditional methods. Careful observation. Physical evidence. Witness statements. Logical reconstruction. Patience. Every object inside the house had potential significance. Something that appeared ordinary could become a crucial clue. Something that seemed unimportant could help establish a timeline. The smallest details often become the foundation of major investigations. The basement immediately drew attention. It was the place where Sandra's final moments had occurred. Detectives examined the area carefully, looking for evidence of the struggle and attempting to understand how the attack unfolded. The location itself raised difficult questions. Why the basement? Why there? Was it selected because it offered privacy? Was the attacker already inside the house? Had the violence been planned? Or had the situation changed unexpectedly? Investigators knew that understanding the location could help them understand the offender. Crime scenes often reveal something about the person who created them. The level of preparation. The degree of control. The relationship between victim and attacker. The choices made before and after violence occurs. In this case, those choices would become central to understanding Richard Lucan's possible involvement. The discovery of Sandra's body meant the investigation immediately became a murder inquiry. Her death was not an isolated tragedy. It was connected to the attack on Veronica and to the disappearance of a man who had a direct connection to both women. The police had a possible suspect. But they did not have the suspect. That distinction would define the entire case. In many investigations, identifying a suspect is the beginning of the process. Here, it became one of the greatest obstacles. Richard Lucan was not an anonymous stranger who could simply vanish unnoticed. His name was known. His social connections were extensive. His movements could be investigated through people who knew him. Yet those same connections created complexity. He belonged to a world where privacy was valued. A world where personal matters were often handled quietly. A world where social relationships could extend across powerful circles. Rumors would later suggest that these connections may have helped him escape. But in those first hours, police had only one objective: find him. Locating Richard became urgent because investigators needed answers while memories were fresh and evidence was still available. They needed to speak with him. They needed to understand his version of events. They needed to determine whether he was a victim of circumstances or the person responsible. But his whereabouts were already becoming uncertain. That uncertainty created the first signs of the mystery that would later dominate the case. A missing suspect is not simply an investigative problem. It changes the emotional reality of the entire situation. For Sandra's family, there was no immediate sense of justice. For Veronica, there was no confrontation with the person she accused. For investigators, there was no opportunity to ask questions directly. The normal path of criminal justice had been interrupted. Meanwhile, outside the house, public attention was growing. News organizations quickly recognized the significance of the story. The combination of an aristocratic suspect, a violent crime, and a disappearance created enormous interest. But behind the headlines, detectives continued working through facts. They did not have the luxury of speculation. They needed evidence. One of the most important pieces of information came from Veronica herself. Her account of the attack provided investigators with a direct link between the crime and Richard. She stated that the attacker was her estranged husband. Her identification became a central part of the investigation. However, investigators still needed to build a case beyond one person's testimony. They examined Richard's relationship with Veronica. They examined the history of their separation. They examined the custody dispute. They examined his financial circumstances. They examined his actions before and after the attack. The investigation expanded beyond the walls of the townhouse. Every person who